I left Regina around 7 in the evening, which was already later than I'd planned. The meeting had run long, and I'd been stuck in a conference room listening to budget projections while the winter sun set early and the temperature dropped like a stone. By the time I got on the road, it was full dark, and the thermometer in my car read -32°C, the kind of cold that makes the prairies feel like another planet, hostile and indifferent to human life. Highway 16 between Regina and Saskatoon is one of those stretches where you can drive for 20 minutes without seeing another vehicle. In winter, at night, it feels like you're the last person alive, just your headlights cutting through the darkness, the occasional flash of reflective markers on the shoulder, and the vast emptiness of Saskatchewan spreading out on all sides. I'd driven this route 100 times. I knew every town, every grid road, every place where the highway curved, just enough to keep you paying attention. The radio was playing classic rock, something from the 70s that I wasn't really listening to. I was thinking about getting home, about the leftover chili in my fridge, about whether I'd remembered to turn down the thermostat before I left that morning. Normal thoughts, the kind of mental static that fills your head on a long, boring drive. I was maybe 20 minutes outside of Borden when I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were on the horizon, maybe from a farm I'd never noticed before. But as I got closer, I realized they were above the road, hovering. Not high up like airplane lights, but maybe 30 or 40 feet off the ground, directly over where I knew the Borden Bridge crossed the North Saskatchewan River. They were pale, blue-white, like LED lights, but softer somehow. Colder. There were maybe 7 or 8 of them, perfectly spherical, each about the size of a basketball. They hung there in the air, motionless, and something about them made my stomach clench. I eased off the gas, slowing from 110 to 80, then to 60. My first rational thought was maintenance work. Maybe they were repairing something on the bridge and had set up lights. But it was past 8 o'clock on a Thursday night in February. Nobody does bridge work in the dark when it's -32. As I got closer, maybe 200 meters from the bridge, the lights started moving. Not drifting the way a balloon or a piece of paper might move in the wind. Moving with purpose. They shifted positions in perfect synchronization, forming a horizontal line across the width of the bridge. Then they scattered, shooting off in different directions before converging again in the center, stacking vertically like some kind of aerial formation. The movements were too precise, too coordinated. They looked like they were following instructions, performing a pattern that meant something. I pulled onto the shoulder and put the car in park. My hands were shaking, though I wasn't sure if it was from cold or from something else. I turned off the radio. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the tick of my engine and the whisper of wind against the car windows. I sat there and watched the lights perform their incomprehensible dance. They'd form shapes, triangles, circles, lines hold the formation for a few seconds, then break apart and reform into something else. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern I couldn't quite grasp, but that felt like it should mean something. Like I was watching a language I didn't speak being written in light against the darkness. The whole time, they stayed centered over the bridge, over the frozen river beneath it. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 3 minutes, maybe longer. Time felt strange, elastic, but eventually, the lights stopped their pattern making. They converged into a tight cluster at the center of the bridge, hovering there for a moment, pulsing slightly brighter. And then, all at once, they shot straight up into the sky and vanished. Not gradually, not fading out. They just accelerated upward faster than anything I'd ever seen and were gone, leaving nothing but the normal darkness and the stars and my headlights illuminating the empty highway ahead. I sat there for another minute, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Drones, maybe, some kind of light display, except drones don't move like that. And who would be flying drones over a bridge in the middle of nowhere in February, when it's cold enough to freeze your fingers off in minutes? Eventually, I put the car back in gear and started driving. The bridge was maybe 50 meters ahead. As I approached it, my radio cut to static, not the kind of static you get when you're between stations. Sharp, harsh white noise that made me flinch and reach for the volume knob. I turned it off. In the sudden silence, I noticed my phone screen was dark. I glanced at it. No signal. The little icon that usually showed 4 or 5 bars was empty. I drove across the bridge slowly, my headlights showing nothing unusual, just pavement and guardrails and the metal structure of the bridge itself. The river below was frozen solid, covered in snow, invisible in the darkness. On the other side, I kept driving, expecting my radio to come back on, expecting my phone to reconnect. Neither did. The static, when I turned the radio back on, was just as harsh. My phone stayed dead, no signal, no connection to anything. It stayed that way for the next 10 miles. I drove through that dead zone, no music, no phone, just the sound of my tires on asphalt and my own breathing. When the radio finally crackled back to life, playing the middle of some song I didn't recognize, I actually gasped. I checked my phone, 4 bars, full signal, like nothing had happened. I drove straight home. I didn't stop in Borden like I sometimes did for coffee. I just wanted to be home, wanted to be inside with the doors locked and the lights on and everything normal. I didn't let myself think too hard about what I'd seen. I told myself there was an explanation. There had to be, but I couldn't leave it alone. The next day, Friday, I kept thinking about those lights, about the way they moved, about the radio and phone cutting out, about the absolute certainty I'd felt, watching them, that I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. That evening, I drove back to Borden. It was earlier this time, still light out, and I wanted to look at the bridge in daylight. Wanted to see if there was anything unusual about it, anything that might explain what I'd seen. The bridge looked completely normal. Standard Saskatchewan highway bridge, steel and concrete, crossing the North Saskatchewan River. I pulled over on the shoulder and got out, the cold hitting me like a physical force. I walked to the bridge and looked down at the frozen river. Flat, white, empty, nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain lights hovering in the air. I went into Borden, which is barely a town anymore. Maybe a few hundred people, a gas station, a couple of grain elevators. I filled up my tank even though I didn't need gas, went inside and bought a coffee. The woman at the counter was older, maybe 70, with sharp eyes and the kind of weathered face you get from decades of prairie winters. I asked her if there was ever any maintenance work done on the bridge at night. She looked at me for a long moment, then asked why I wanted to know. I told her I'd seen lights there the night before. Strange lights. I didn't go into detail. I didn't want to sound crazy. Her expression changed. The professional customer service smile disappeared, replaced by something harder, something that looked like fear. "You saw them," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Saw what?" She glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer. "The lights, over the bridge. They've been seen since 1957. A lot of people have seen them. Nobody talks about it much, but everybody knows." The way she said 1957 made my skin prickle. What happened in 1957? She poured herself a coffee, added cream and sugar, with hands that weren't quite steady. School bus went through the ice. February 14th, Valentine's Day. The driver was taking kids home from a Valentine's party at the school. He tried to cross the river on the ice road. It's a shortcut, saves about 20 minutes, but the ice wasn't solid enough. Bus went through, sank. 12 children died, the driver too. I felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. They drowned? Most of them. Some might have frozen. The water's cold enough, you don't last long. They got the bus out eventually, got the bodies out, buried them in the cemetery about 2 miles from here. But people started seeing the lights not long after. February nights, always February, when it's cold. They appear over the bridge, moving around like they're looking for something. Looking for what? She met my eyes. The way home, that's what people say. Those children were going home when they died. They never made it, and some part of them is still trying. I thanked her and left. I drove back to Saskatoon with my radio turned up loud, trying to drown out my own thoughts. I told myself it was just a story, small town legend, the kind of thing people tell to make sense of tragedy. But I couldn't stop thinking about those lights, about the way they moved with purpose, with pattern, about the feeling I'd had, watching them, that they were trying to communicate something. I've driven that route probably 20 times since then, always during the day. I've never taken Highway 16 at night in February. I tell myself it's because of the cold, because winter driving at night is dangerous. But that's not really why. Last week, I was talking to a colleague who grew up in Borden. I mentioned the lights, trying to sound casual about it. She went quiet for a moment, then said her grandfather used to see them. Said he'd been one of the men who pulled the bus out of the river in 1957. That afterward, he'd had nightmares for years. Dreams about cold and darkness, and children's voices calling for help. He'd started seeing the lights in the 70s, she said. Would wake up in the middle of the night and drive out to the bridge, stand there in the cold and watch them move. Her grandmother thought he was losing his mind, but he said he had to watch, had to witness. Said those children deserved to have someone see them, to know they were still there. He died in 1995. She said that the night he died, there were lights over the bridge. Multiple people reported it, not the usual 7 or 8, dozens of them, filling the sky over the river. They appeared around 9 at night and stayed until dawn, barely moving, just hovering there like they were waiting for something. I think about those 12 children sometimes, about Valentine's Day 1957, about kids dressed in their best clothes with valentines and candy, excited and happy, going home to show their parents what they'd gotten, about the moment when the driver realized the ice was breaking, about the water rushing in, about the cold and the dark and the terror, about parents waiting for children who never arrived, about a town that has carried that grief for over 60 years. And I think about those lights, appearing on cold February nights, moving in patterns that might be desperate attempts at communication, or might be nothing but reflected memories burned into the fabric of the world. I think about 12 children who never made it home, who might still be looking for the way, might still be confused about why their parents never came to get them, why they're still here in the cold and the dark above a frozen river. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. I don't know if I believe that consciousness can persist after death, that tragedy can leave marks that last for decades. But I know what I saw. I know those lights were real, that they moved with intention, that something cut off my radio and phone signal when I crossed that bridge. And I know that in Borden, there's a cemetery with 12 small graves, and that every February, people see lights over the North Saskatchewan River. The woman at the gas station told me one more thing before I left. She said that sometimes, if you're on the bridge when the lights appear, you can hear singing, children's voices, singing songs they probably learned in school. She said her husband heard it once, pulled over because he thought there was something wrong with his radio, but the singing wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from outside, from the air itself. A dozen young voices singing, "You Are My Sunshine," clear and sweet and unbearably sad. I haven't driven past that bridge at night since February. I don't plan to, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I think about those lights and what they might mean. I think about 12 children who just wanted to go home, who never understood why they couldn't, and I wonder if they're still looking, if they'll always be looking. If February nights over the North Saskatchewan River will forever be marked by pale blue-white spheres dancing in patterns that might be messages we're not equipped to read. I wonder if they know they're dead. I wonder if they understand what happened. Or if some part of them is still sitting on that bus, still excited about Valentine's Day, still thinking they're almost home, just a few more minutes, just across this river, just a little farther, still looking for the way, still searching, still waiting for someone to show them how to get there, how to finally make it back to the homes they left 67 years ago and have been trying to reach ever since. My brother Derek and I had been planning the hunting trip for months. October in the Qu'Appelle Valley is perfect for white-tailed deer. The rut brings the bucks out, makes them careless, and the weather is usually decent enough that you can sit in a ground blind for hours without losing feeling in your fingers. We'd gotten permission from a landowner near Lebret to hunt on his property, a few hundred acres of mixed forest and grassland that ran down to the edge of one of the valley's many lakes. We drove out before dawn on a Saturday, the truck loaded with our gear and enough supplies for a full day in the field. The Qu'Appelle Valley is one of those places that feels ancient even when you're just driving through it. The valley cuts through the prairie like a wound, deep and sudden, with steep walls and a chain of lakes running along the bottom. The Cree name for it means the valley that calls, and there are stories about it that go back hundreds of years. Stories about voices echoing through the coulees, about sounds that don't have sources, about the valley calling to people in ways that aren't entirely natural. I'd always written those stories off as folklore, the kind of thing tourists like to hear when they're visiting. But that morning, hiking into the valley in the pre-dawn darkness, I felt something I'd never felt there before. An uneasiness that had nothing to do with the physical challenge of navigating rough terrain in the dark. The valley felt like it was watching us, waiting for something. We set up our ground blind on the edge of a coulee that overlooked a small creek. Good sight lines, multiple game trails converging near the water, thick brush on the far side that deer like to bed down in. We settled in just as the sun was starting to lighten the eastern sky, and then began the long wait that is 90% of hunting. 2 hours passed. We saw a few does, a couple of young bucks that weren't worth taking. The sun climbed higher, warming the air enough that I could feel my toes again. Derek was scanning the tree line with his binoculars, patient and focused the way he always was when hunting. I was starting to think about the sandwiches in my pack when we heard it. A voice, a woman's voice, calling out from somewhere across the valley. It was distant but clear, carrying across the open space with that particular acoustic quality the valley has, where sounds seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She was calling a name. I couldn't quite make it out, something like Marcus or Martin, but the tone was unmistakable. Distress, fear, the kind of voice you hear when someone has lost a child in a crowded store, that edge of rising panic. Derek lowered his binoculars and looked at me. "You hear that?" "Yeah, probably someone from one of the cottages. Maybe their dog got loose or something." We listened. The calling continued, echoing off the valley walls. But it wasn't moving. Most sounds, you can track them, figure out where they're coming from, by the way they change as the source moves. This wasn't like that. It was stationary, constant, and the echo made it impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to be coming from across the creek, maybe half a mile away, but I couldn't be sure. "That doesn't sound like someone looking for a dog," Derek said. There was something in his voice I didn't like, a tension I hadn't heard before. The calling got louder, more desperate. The woman, whoever she was crying now, her voice breaking on the name she kept repeating. It went on for maybe 5 minutes, long enough that I started to feel genuinely unsettled. This wasn't normal. Even if it was just someone from the cottages, the level of distress in that voice suggested something was seriously wrong. "We should check it out," Derek said, already starting to pack up his gear. "It's probably nothing. Someone's idea of a prank, or maybe it's a recording." "A recording? Out here?" He looked at me like I'd suggested aliens. "Someone's in trouble. We need to check." I didn't want to. Every instinct I had was telling me to stay where we were, to ignore the voice, to let it be someone else's problem. But Derek was already moving, and I couldn't let him go alone. So I packed up my gear and followed him down into the coulee and across the creek, heading in the direction we thought the voice was coming from. The terrain got rougher as we went. Thicker brush, more deadfall, steep slopes that made the hiking harder than it should have been. The calling continued the whole time, that same desperate repetition of a name, that same anguished tone, but it never seemed to get closer. We'd hike for 10 minutes, and it would sound exactly as distant as it had when we started. Derek noticed it too. I could see him getting frustrated, trying to figure out where the hell the sound was actually coming from. We'd been hiking for maybe 40 minutes when we found the clearing. It appeared suddenly, a break in the trees that opened onto a flat area maybe 50 yards across. And in the center of the clearing were the remains of a homestead, just a stone foundation, the house itself long gone, with a few scattered pieces of rusted farm equipment half buried in the grass. The foundation was substantial, the kind of stonework that takes real skill and time. This had been someone's home once, someone's attempt at building a life in this valley. The calling was louder here, much louder. It was coming from the clearing, from somewhere inside that stone foundation. Derek and I approached slowly, our rifles held ready more from instinct than any real sense of threat. As we got closer, I could see that the foundation wasn't empty. In the center, ringed by stones, was a well. It had no cover, no safety barrier, just an open hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet across, with darkness below. The stones around the edge were old, weathered, covered in lichen and moss, and the calling was coming from down there, from inside the well, echoing up from whatever depths it reached. Derek walked right up to the edge and looked down. I stayed back, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. I was rooted there, listening to that voice, crying out from underground, calling a name I still couldn't quite understand. "Hello?" Derek called down into the well. "Are you hurt? Can you hear me?" The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Derek and I looked at each other. He was about to call down again when a voice answered, but it wasn't the woman's voice. It was a man's voice, deep and rough. and it came from the same place, from inside the well, from deep underground. "Have you seen my wife?" the voice asked. "I'm looking for my wife. She fell in. I need to get her out." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong with the voice, something that made it sound not quite human. The words were clear, but there was a quality to them, a flatness, like someone reading from a script they didn't understand. "We need to go," I said to Derek, "right now." "Someone's down there," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. He sounded scared, and Derek didn't scare easily. "Have you seen her?" the voice asked again. "She was wearing her blue dress, the one she wore when we got married. She fell in and I can't reach her. I need to get her out." Derek backed away from the well. I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the tree line. The voice kept talking, asking the same questions, the tone never changing. As we reached the edge of the clearing, the woman's voice started up again, calling that name, crying, desperate. But now it was joined by the man's voice, both of them calling from the well, overlapping, creating a sound that shouldn't be possible from a single source. We ran. I'm not proud of it, but we ran through that forest like something was chasing us, crashing through brush, slipping on slopes, not stopping until we made it back to the truck. We threw our gear in the bed and drove out of there without a word. It wasn't until we were back on the highway, miles from the valley, that either of us spoke. "What the hell was that?" Derek asked. I didn't have an answer. I didn't want to think about it. We stopped at a gas station in La Brette, and I used their bathroom, trying to wash the feeling of that place off my skin. While Derek was filling the tank, I asked the attendant if he knew anything about old homesteads in the valley. He was maybe 60, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life working outside. "Lot of old homesteads out there," he said. "Most of them from the early 1900s. Settlers came in, tried to farm. Most of them failed and moved on. Any of them have wells? Open wells?" He looked at me strangely. "You found the Ashworth place." "I don't know what it's called. Just a stone foundation with a well in the middle." His expression changed. He set down the squeegee he'd been using to clean windshields and leaned against the pump. "That's the Ashworth place. Been abandoned since 1923. Nobody goes out there anymore. Not locals anyway." "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment, deciding how much to tell me. Finally, he said, "Woman named Sarah Ashworth fell into that well in April of 1923. Her husband, Marcus, tried to get her out, tied a rope around his waist, and had his brother hold on to it while he went down. But the well was deep and the walls were slick. He couldn't reach her, couldn't pull her out. His brother said he called up that he could hear her down there, still alive, crying for help. Marcus told his brother to pull him up, that he needed to get better rope, better equipment. His brother pulled, but the rope broke. Marcus fell. They both died down there. It took 3 days to get the bodies out. My mouth was dry. They sealed the well, right? After? They tried. But every time they'd cover it, something would knock the cover off. They tried boards, they tried steel grating, they tried filling it with rocks. Nothing stayed. Eventually, people just stopped going out there. Said the place was cursed. Said you could hear them down there, Marcus and Sarah, still trying to get out. We left La Brette and drove back to Saskatoon. Neither of us talked much. What was there to say? We'd heard something that shouldn't exist. Voices calling from a well where 2 people died 100 years ago. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Some acoustic phenomenon, sound traveling through underground passages, maybe wind creating harmonics in the well shaft. But I couldn't make myself believe it, because I'd heard what that voice asked. "Have you seen my wife?" Marcus Ashworth asking the same question he'd been asking since 1923, still trying to save her, still stuck in that moment of desperation and failure. I tried to find more information. I spent hours in the archives, digging through old newspapers and county records. I found the article about the accident, dated the 17th of April 1923. It matched what the gas station attendant had told us. Sarah Ashworth, age 26, fell into a well on the family homestead. Marcus Ashworth, age 28, died attempting to rescue her. Both bodies recovered 3 days later. Survived by Marcus's brother, Thomas Ashworth, who witnessed the accident. I found one more thing. A letter to the editor from 1925, written by Thomas Ashworth. He wrote about hearing voices from the well, about his brother calling for help, about Sarah crying. He wrote about trying to fill the well, about how nothing would stay, how the valley seemed to reject any attempt to seal it. He wrote that he was leaving, moving to Ontario, that he couldn't stay in a place where his brother's voice called to him every time the wind blew through the coulees. Derek and I haven't been back to the Qu'Appelle Valley. We've hunted other places, other provinces, but not there. Not anywhere near Lebret or that clearing or that well. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. That woman's voice, calling a name. That man's voice, asking if we've seen his wife. And I wonder if they know they're dead. If they understand that it's been 100 years since they fell into that darkness. Or if they're still living that moment over and over, trapped in the split second between falling and hitting the water, never reaching bottom, never finding each other, just calling out forever in the dark. The Cree were right, the valley does call, but it's not the valley itself. It's the people who died there, who got trapped there, who never found their way out. Their voices echo off the coulees and the steep valley walls, preserved somehow, repeated endlessly. And if you're unlucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, you'll hear them. You'll hear Marcus Ashworth asking if you've seen his wife. You'll hear Sarah Ashworth crying out his name. And there's nothing you can do to help them. They're beyond help. They've been beyond help since 1923. All you can do is leave and try not to think about them and hope their voices don't follow you home. But they do follow you, not literally, but in your memory, in your dreams, in the quiet moments when you're alone and the world is still. You hear them calling across 80 years of darkness, still searching, still hoping, still believing that somehow, someone will finally show them the way out. I'd been photographing Saskatchewan's abandoned industrial sites for about 3 years when I first heard about Claybank. It came up in a conversation with another photographer at a gallery opening in Regina. He mentioned the old brick plant, said it was one of the best preserved industrial ruins in the province. The plant had closed in 1989, he told me, and the town that had grown up around it had emptied out not long after. But unlike most ghost towns, where everything gets stripped or vandalized, Claybank had been largely left alone. The buildings were still standing, the machinery was still in place, and if I wanted to document industrial heritage, this was the place to go. I drove out on a Sunday morning in early September. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the low 20s, that particular quality of prairie light that makes everything look sharp and defined. Claybank is about an hour south of Regina, accessible by grid roads that get progressively worse the closer you get. The last 5 miles were on dirt that hadn't been graded in years, washboard rough, the kind of road that makes you wonder if you're going to shake your car apart before you reach your destination. The town appeared suddenly as I crested a low hill. The brick plant dominated everything, a massive industrial complex of kilns and stacks and warehouses, all built from the same distinctive Claybank brick that had made the town's reputation. But around the plant were other buildings, houses, maybe 20 or 30 of them, arranged along what had been streets, a school, and set slightly apart on a small rise, a church with a white steeple that caught the morning sun. I parked near the plant and got out, my camera bag over my shoulder. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not the normal quiet of the countryside, where you hear wind and birds and the distant sound of farm equipment. This was deeper, more complete, like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something. I spent the first hour photographing the plant. The exterior shots were straightforward architectural details, the way decay had begun to soften the hard industrial lines, the contrast between human construction and nature slowly reclaiming it. Inside was better. The machinery was still there, massive brick-making equipment frozen in mid-operation, covered in dust and rust but fundamentally intact. I worked my way through the space methodically, shooting everything, losing myself in the technical challenges of capturing low light and deep shadows. When I came back outside, the sun was higher, and the town looked different, less picturesque, more unsettling. Those houses with their empty windows, that school with its playground equipment still standing, rusted and motionless. And the church on its hill, its white paint peeling but its structure solid, its door visible even from where I stood. I decided to photograph the church next. Something about it drew me. The way it stood apart from everything else, like it was watching over the dead town. I walked up the hill, my boots loud on the gravel path, and tried the door. It opened easily, unlocked, the hinges protesting but functional. Inside, I stopped and just stared. The church was intact, not just structurally intact, furnished. The pews were still arranged in neat rows, maybe seating for 100 people. Hymnals were stacked on some of the seats, their covers faded but readable. The altar at the front was bare except for a wooden cross. Windows on both sides let in dusty light that made everything look soft and dreamlike. And there was sound, singing, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A hymn being sung in four-part harmony, the melody familiar in that way old Protestant hymns are. Even if you can't name the specific song, the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, not directional, just present in the air itself. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, trying to identify a source. Speakers, maybe, some kind of audio installation left behind. But I didn't see anything. No electronics, no wires, nothing that could produce sound. Just the empty church and the singing that filled it. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The singing continued, steady and unchanging, as I walked slowly down the center aisle. I moved the phone around, trying to capture the sound from different positions, different angles. My footsteps on the wooden floor were loud in comparison, a counterpoint to the ethereal quality of the voices. I recorded for maybe 5 minutes, then played it back. The singing was there, clear and distinct, but underneath it was something else. A low murmuring, like the sound of many voices speaking at once. Not English, not any language I recognized. Just a constant undertone of speech, rising and falling, overlapping, creating a texture beneath the hymn that made my skin crawl. I left the church quickly, pulling the door shut behind me. Outside, in the sunlight and the open air, I could still hear it faintly. The singing carrying through the walls, through the door, dissipating in the prairie wind but not quite disappearing. I tried the school next. It was a small building, maybe 4 classrooms, with a separate entrance for what looked like a basement gymnasium. The main door was unlocked like the church had been. Inside, I found classrooms frozen in time desks, still in rows, chalkboards still mounted on walls, even a few papers scattered on the floor. And sounds, children's voices, reciting something in unison. The alphabet maybe, or a poem, or a times table. The voices were high and clear, the way children's voices are, and they spoke with that particular rhythm of rote memorization. I recorded it. When I played it back, the children's voices were there, but so was the murmuring. That same underlying texture of many voices speaking at once in a language I couldn't identify. I went through the town systematically after that, building by building. Every structure had sounds. The houses had conversations, adult voices discussing mundane things, the clatter of dishes, footsteps on floors. One house had a radio playing, or what sounded like a radio, music from maybe the 1960s. Another had a child crying, not distressed, just the normal crying of a young child. Normal sounds. The sounds of people living their lives. But there was no one there. Claybank had been abandoned for over 30 years. The houses were empty, furnished in some cases but unoccupied, and yet the sounds continued, constant and consistent, in every building I entered. By early afternoon, I had maybe 2 hours of recordings on my phone. I sat in my car and played through some of them, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The singing from the church, the children from the school, the domestic sounds from the houses, and underneath everything, that murmuring, that constant undertone of many voices speaking in unison. I drove back to Regina and spent the evening organizing my photos. The images were good, exactly what I'd hoped to capture, but I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds, about what they might mean, so I started reaching out to people, linguists first. I sent them clips of the murmuring, asked if they could identify the language. The responses were puzzling. Every linguist I contacted said the same thing. It sounded like language, had the structure and rhythm of speech, but they couldn't identify it. One professor from the University of Saskatchewan said it reminded her of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, but more organized, more purposeful. Another said it sounded like prayer, like the kind of communal prayer you'd hear in certain religious traditions, but the actual words were unintelligible. I contacted historians next, asking about Claybank's history. What I learned was straightforward enough. The town had been built around the brick plant, which opened in 1914. At its peak in the 1950s, maybe 500 people lived there. The plant had closed in 1989 when demand for brick collapsed, and the town had emptied out over the next few years. By 1995, Claybank was essentially abandoned. The province had since designated it a historic site, maintained the plant for occasional tours, but the rest of the town was left to decay. Nothing in the official history explained the sounds. Nothing suggested Claybank had been anything other than a normal company town, people working at the plant, raising families, going to church, living ordinary lives. No tragedies, no mass deaths. No reason for it to be anything other than a normal ghost town. But ghost towns don't have sounds like this. They don't have hymns in empty churches and children reciting lessons in abandoned schools. They don't have conversations echoing through houses where no one has lived for decades. I went back to Claybank 3 weeks later. I told myself it was to get more photographs, to complete the project. But really, I needed to understand. I needed to prove to myself that what I'd experienced was real, that the recordings weren't some kind of malfunction or audio artifact. I arrived in the late afternoon this time, the sun already starting to sink toward the horizon. The town looked the same, empty, waiting, that sense of held breath I'd felt before. I went straight to the church. The door was unlocked as before. Inside, the singing started almost immediately. The same hymn, or a different one that sounded similar. The same 4-part harmony, the same murmuring underneath. I set up my recording equipment properly this time. Not just my phone, but a directional microphone, a digital recorder, everything I'd borrowed from a friend who did field recordings for nature documentaries. I recorded from different positions in the church, near the altar, in the center aisle, at the back by the door. The singing never changed, never got louder or quieter, just maintained that same constant presence. When I left the church, the sun was setting. I should have driven back to Regina then, should have left before dark. But I didn't. I wanted to hear what Claybank sounded like at night, when the light was gone and the town was completely isolated. I waited in my car as darkness fell. The silence outside was absolute. No coyotes, no wind, nothing. Just the vast prairie night and the dead town and me sitting there with my recording equipment, waiting for something I couldn't name. Around 9 o'clock, the sounds changed. Not dramatically, just a shift in quality. The singing from the church got louder. The voices from the houses became more distinct, and the murmuring underneath everything intensified, became more urgent. It no longer sounded like the background texture of prayer. It sounded like pleading, like dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, begging for something in a language that shouldn't exist. I got out of the car and walked through the dark town with my recorder running. The sounds surrounded me. Every building was alive with them now. The school had not just children reciting lessons, but children playing, laughing, running. The houses had full conversations, the clink of silverware on plates, the sound of televisions. And from the church came that singing, clearer now, loud enough that I could almost make out the words of the hymn. But there was still no one there. I shone my flashlight through windows, into open doors, empty rooms, empty pews, empty classrooms. Just the sounds of a town that had been dead for 30 years, playing out the routines of life like an echo that refused to fade. I recorded until my battery died, then got back in my car and drove out of Claybank. In my rearview mirror, I could see the church on its hill, dark against the night sky. And I swear I could still hear the singing, even with my windows rolled up, even after I'd driven miles away. It followed me back to the highway, fading only when I reached pavement and turned north toward Regina. I've analyzed those recordings hundreds of times. I've had them examined by audio engineers, by physicists who specialize in acoustics, by anyone who might be able to explain them. No one can. The sounds are real, not artifacts, not electronic interference, not anything explainable by conventional means. They're just there. Voices in empty buildings, hymns in an abandoned church, children in a school where no child has set foot in over 30 years. And that murmuring, that constant undertone, remains unidentified. One linguist suggested it might be a constructed language, something someone created and recorded. But that doesn't explain why it's playing in a ghost town with no power, no speakers, no equipment. Another suggested it might be some kind of mass memory, the accumulated impression of decades of human activity somehow preserved in the physical structure of the place. But I don't think that's what it is. I think it's something else. I think the people of Claybank are still there, in some way we don't understand. Still going to church, still sending their children to school, still living their lives in the houses they built. still praying for something in a language that exists nowhere else, begging for something they'll never receive. I haven't been back to Claybank. I've archived the photographs, published some of them, given talks about documenting industrial heritage. But I never mention the sounds. I never play the recordings for audiences, because I don't know what to tell them. I don't know how to explain that a town can die but not be dead, that people can leave but somehow still remain. The recordings are on my computer, backed up on 3 separate drives. Sometimes, late at night, I open them and listen. To the hymns, to the children, to the conversations, and to that murmuring underneath everything, constant and urgent, speaking in a language that might be prayer or might be something else entirely. Speaking to us, maybe. Or to whatever it is that decides whether a place truly dies or just appears to, still begging, still hoping, still believing that somehow, someone will finally understand what they're asking for and find a way to give it to them. But no one understands. And Claybank remains empty and full, silent and singing, dead and alive. A town where nothing lives but everything continues, where the congregation still gathers on Sunday mornings to sing hymns in an empty church, where children still learn their lessons in rooms without teachers, where people still live lives that ended decades ago and might never truly end at all. I was 3 months into my research project on population decline in rural Saskatchewan when I first drove through Tramping Lake. The project was straightforward: visit small communities, interview residents about why people leave, document the economic and social factors that turn thriving towns into collections of empty buildings. I'd been to maybe 15 towns already, all following similar patterns. Young people leaving for cities, schools closing, businesses shutting down, populations aging and shrinking until only the most stubborn or the most trapped remained. Tramping Lake was on my list because it represented an extreme case. The 1,971 census recorded 425 people. By 2021, that number had dropped to 94. I wanted to understand what happened to a place when it lost 80% of its population in 50 years. I left Saskatoon early on a Tuesday morning in late June, planning to spend the day in Tramping Lake and the surrounding area. The drive was about 2.5 hours, mostly on highways that got progressively smaller and less maintained. Tramping Lake sits in west-central Saskatchewan, in that part of the province where the landscape starts to shift from pure prairie to something that hints at parkland. More trees, more rolling terrain, more water in the sloughs, and potholes. I arrived around 2:30 in the afternoon. The town was smaller than I'd expected, even accounting for the population decline. Maybe 24 houses, a community hall, a few buildings that might have been businesses once. And at the edge of town, a gas station. It looked operational, the pumps were intact, the building was painted, there was a sign advertising diesel and regular unleaded. I pulled in, more out of habit than need. My tank was about half full, but I'd learned on these research trips that you fill up whenever you have the chance. Rural gas stations can be few and far between, and running out of fuel 50 kilometers from the nearest town is not an experience I wanted to repeat. The attendant came out as I was pulling up to the pump. He was maybe 60, wearing coveralls and a baseball cap, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outside. He was friendly in that particular way. Rural Saskatchewan people are not effusive, but genuinely interested, asking questions that were polite rather than intrusive. "Passing through?" he asked as he started filling my tank. "Full service." I hadn't seen a full-service station in years. "Research trip. I'm studying population change in rural communities." He nodded, unsurprised. "Well, you picked the right place. Not many of us left. Most everyone who could leave did. Now it's just us old-timers, waiting it out." We talked while he filled the tank. He warned me about deer on the highway, said they'd been bad this year, coming out right at dusk when they were hardest to see. He recommended I get where I was going before dark if I could. I told him I was planning to do some interviews in town, then head back to Saskatoon. Should be on the road by 5 or 6 at the latest. He finished filling the tank, and I followed him inside to pay. The station interior was dated but clean linoleum floors, shelves stocked with basic supplies, a counter with an old mechanical cash register. He wrote out a receipt by hand, the kind with carbon paper that creates duplicates. I paid cash, thanked him, and walked back to my car. I got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the station. I was heading east, back toward the highway, planning to stop at a few houses to see if anyone would talk to me. That's the last clear memory I have of that afternoon. The next thing I remember is darkness. Complete darkness, the kind you only get in rural areas with no light pollution. I was still driving, my headlights cutting through the night, but I had no memory of the sun setting, no memory of dusk, no transition from afternoon to night. Just a gap, like someone had cut 6 hours out of my life and spliced the remaining pieces together. I pulled over immediately, my heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. I checked my phone, 9:47 p.m. The last time I'd looked at my phone had been at the gas station, right before I paid, 3:15 p.m. 6.5 hours were just gone. I looked at my gas gauge, nearly empty, but I'd just filled up. I'd watched the attendant fill the tank to the top. I checked the odometer, trying to remember what it had read at the gas station. I couldn't recall the exact number, but I knew roughly what my total mileage had been. According to the current reading, I'd driven 340 kilometers since filling up. I pulled up my GPS to see where I was. The screen showed a grid road about 3 kilometers outside of Tramping Lake, heading east. The same direction I'd been going when I left the gas station. But I'd lost 6.5 hours and driven 340 kilometers, and somehow ended up almost exactly where I'd started. I sat there on the side of the road for maybe 20 minutes, trying to find a rational explanation. Had I fallen asleep while driving? But I wasn't tired. Didn't feel groggy or disoriented in the way you do after waking up. Had I hit my head somehow, gotten a concussion? I felt my skull carefully. No bumps, no pain, no signs of injury. Had I been drugged? But I hadn't eaten or drunk anything except water from my own bottle. Eventually, I started driving again. I drove straight back to Saskatoon, checking my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see something following me, though I didn't know what. I made it home around midnight and spent the rest of the night researching missing time experiences, trying to find something that matched what I'd been through. The next morning, I knew I had to go back. I needed to understand what had happened. I needed to prove to myself that it was real, that I hadn't experienced some kind of psychotic break or neurological event. So I drove back to Tramping Lake, arriving around noon, in full daylight this time. I went straight to the gas station and stopped, confused. When I saw it, the building was still there, but it was clearly abandoned. The windows were broken, covered with plywood. The gas pumps were gone, leaving just concrete islands with rusted mounting bolts. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. The whole place had the look of something that hadn't been operational in years, maybe decades. I got out and walked around the building. The door was locked, but I could see through the broken windows. Inside was empty. No shelves, no cash register, no linoleum floors. Just concrete and dust and debris. This wasn't a station that had closed recently. This was a station that had been dead for a long time. I drove into town proper and found an older woman working in her garden. I introduced myself, asked about the gas station. When had it closed? "Oh, that old place," she said. "Closed in 1998, maybe 99. The owner died and nobody wanted to take it over. Been sitting empty ever since." "Are you sure?" "I was there yesterday afternoon. Got gas, talked to the attendant." She gave me a strange look. "No, honey, that station's been closed for over 20 years. Nobody's been in there for a long time." I pulled out my receipt, the handwritten one from the day before. I showed it to her. She took it carefully, examined it, turned it over. The paper was yellowed, brittle at the edges. The handwriting was clear, the date, the amount, the station name. But the date was wrong. It said June 14, but yesterday had been June 13. And the year was wrong too, by one digit that was smudged and unclear but might have been a 9 instead of a 2. "Where did you get this?" she asked, handing it back to me like it might burn her. "From the attendant. Yesterday. He filled my tank and wrote this out." She backed away from me slightly. "I don't know what you're playing at, but that station hasn't operated in my lifetime, and I've lived here 63 years. I left Tramping Lake more confused than when I'd arrived. I drove back to Saskatoon with the receipt on my passenger seat, glancing at it every few minutes to confirm it was real. The paper felt old. The ink was faded in places, but the date and the amount were clear enough. Evidence that I'd been to a gas station that didn't exist, had paid an attendant who couldn't possibly be real, and then lost 6 hours of my life. I couldn't let it go. I started researching Tramping Lake obsessively. I found old photographs of the town from the 1960s and 72nds. The gas station was in some of them newer, cleaner, but recognizably the same building. I found a mention of it in a local history book. It had been operated by a man named Harold Dietrich from 1961 until his death in 1998. I found Harold's obituary. He'd been 62 when he died. In the obituary photo, he wore coveralls and a baseball cap. He had a weathered face and a slight smile. He looked exactly like the attendant who'd filled my tank. I posted about my experience on forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. I was careful not to sound too crazy, framing it as a strange experience I was trying to understand. Within a week, I had 3 messages from people who'd had similar experiences. A woman from Alberta said she'd stopped for gas in Tramping Lake in 2015. She remembered the station being operational, remembered talking to an older attendant. She'd driven away and suddenly it was dark. Hours had passed and she couldn't account for the time. When she went back the next day, the station was abandoned. A man from Manitoba had the same story from 2018. He'd filled up, paid cash, gotten a handwritten receipt, lost 4 hours, found himself on a grid road with no memory of driving, went back and found the station had been closed for years. A third person, from Saskatchewan, said it had happened to his father in 2003. His father had stopped in Tramping Lake, gotten gas, and then arrived home 8 hours later than he should have, with no memory of where he'd been. He'd had a receipt from the station, but when they tried to go back, couldn't find it operational. None of us could explain it. We'd compared our experiences, looking for patterns. All of us had stopped at the same gas station. All of us had interacted with an attendant who matched Harold Dietrich's description. All of us had lost hours of time and driven distances we couldn't account for. And all of us had receipts from a station that had been closed since 1998. I've tried to find more information about Harold Dietrich, about his life, his death, what might have happened to tie him to that station in such an impossible way. The obituary was brief. He'd been born in Tramping Lake, never married, operated the gas station his father had built. He died of a heart attack while working. That was all. I've talked to people who knew him. The few remaining residents of Tramping Lake who remember him say he was a good man, quiet, reliable. He loved that gas station, they say, took pride in it. When he died, they found him at the cash register, in the middle of writing out a receipt. Some people thought it was fitting. He died doing what he loved. But none of that explains what's happening. None of that explains how a dead man can still pump gas, can still warn travelers about deer on the highway, can still write out receipts on yellowed paper with faded ink. None of that explains where we go during those missing hours, what we're doing, why we can't remember. I've considered going back. Part of me wants to stop at that station again, to talk to Harold again, to see if I can stay conscious through whatever happens next, to understand what's going on in Tramping Lake, what trap or loop or fold in time exists there that catches travelers and holds them. But I'm terrified, because I don't know what happened during those 6 hours. I don't know where I went or what I did. I don't know if I drove those 340 kilometers in this reality or somewhere else. And I don't know what would happen if I went back, if I'd lose another 6 hours, or 12, or if this time I wouldn't come back at all. The receipt is in a plastic sleeve now, preserved like the artifact it is, physical evidence of an impossible event. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, running my fingers over the handwriting, over the date that's wrong and the amount that seems too low for 2023 gas prices and too high for 1,998. Evidence that Harold Dietrich is still there, still operating his station, still serving travelers on the highway even though he died 25 years ago. Evidence that Tramping Lake is more than a dying town losing its population. That it's a place where time doesn't work right, where the past and present overlap in ways that trap people, steal hours from their lives, and send them back to where they started with no memory of the journey. I still drive through rural Saskatchewan for my research, but I take different routes now. I plan carefully to avoid Tramping Lake, to make sure I'm never anywhere near it when I need gas. Because I know if I stop there again, if I see that station looking operational and clean with Harold Dietrich walking out in his coveralls and baseball cap, I won't be able to resist. I'll pull in. I'll let him fill my tank. I'll go inside and pay and get another handwritten receipt. And then I'll drive away, And the next thing I'll know, it will be dark, and hours will have passed, and I'll be back where I started with no memory of where I've been. And someday, maybe, I won't come back at all. Maybe I'll join whatever exists in those missing hours. Whatever space Harold Dietrich occupies, whatever version of Tramping Lake continues to operate decades after it should have died. Maybe I'll become another story, another warning, another person who stopped for gas in a ghost town and disappeared into time that shouldn't exist. The receipt sits in my desk drawer. Evidence, warning, mystery. And I still don't know what happened during those 6 hours. I don't think I ever will. I met Professor Elizabeth Kwan at the University of Regina in the spring of 2023. She was leading a research project on erosion patterns in the Big Muddy Badlands, and she needed someone to document the rock formations photographically. I'd done similar work before scientific photography, focused on detail and accuracy rather than artistic interpretation, and she'd hired me based on my portfolio. The Big Muddy Badlands occupy a stretch of southern Saskatchewan near the US border, a landscape that looks like it belongs on Mars rather than the Canadian prairies. Deep coulees carved by ancient glacial melt, exposed rock layers showing millions of years of geological history, and a reputation for being one of the most isolated and unforgiving places in the province. In the late 1800s, it had been outlaw country. Horse thieves, cattle rustlers, and men running from the law had used the Badlands as a hideout, taking advantage of the maze-like terrain and the network of caves that riddled the area. We drove out on a Thursday morning in early May, the truck loaded with equipment cameras, measuring tools, sample bags, enough water and supplies for a full day in the field. The plan was to hike to a specific formation Professor Kwan had identified on satellite imagery, document it thoroughly, take sediment samples, and hike back before dark. Simple, routine, the kind of field work I'd done dozens of times. The terrain was harder than I'd expected. The coulees were steep, the footing uncertain, and the exposed rock was sharp enough to shred clothing if you weren't careful. We hiked for about 2 hours before reaching the formation, a section of eroded cliff face that showed distinct sediment layers dating back millions of years. Professor Kwan was excited, already talking about what the layers might tell us about ancient climate patterns. We were about 4 miles from where we'd left the truck, in a part of the Badlands that felt completely isolated from the modern world. No sound of traffic, no airplane contrails overhead, just wind and rock and the vast empty sky. While Professor Kwan set up her measuring equipment, I scouted for good angles to photograph the formation. That's when I found the caves. They were set into the cliff face about 50 feet from where we'd been working, partially hidden by an overhang and centuries of weathering. 3 openings, each maybe 6 feet high, leading back into darkness. I called Professor Kwan over. "Caves," I said. "Should we document these too?" She was already pulling out her flashlight. "Absolutely. Cave formations can tell us a lot about water movement and erosion patterns. Let's take a look." We entered the middle cave, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The entrance chamber was maybe 20 feet deep, with a low ceiling that forced us to crouch slightly. But at the back, there was an opening to a larger space. We squeezed through and found ourselves in a chamber that was significantly bigger, maybe 40 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to 15 feet at its highest point. And the walls were covered in faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, formed by the natural patterns in the rock. Human faces, each about the size of a dinner plate, all with their mouths open, in what looked like screams or shouts. The rock had eroded in such a way that the faces seemed three-dimensional, with deep-set eyes and pronounced features that caught our flashlight beams and created stark shadows. "Pareidolia," Professor Kwan said immediately, moving closer to examine one of the faces. "Humans are evolutionarily programmed to see faces in random patterns. It's why we see faces in clouds, in wood grain, in toast. These are just natural erosion patterns that happen to trigger that recognition response." I moved my flashlight across the chamber wall, counting faces. There were at least 50 visible in the section I could see clearly. "These don't look random," I said. "They're too consistent, too detailed." "Erosion can create remarkably consistent patterns," she said, already pulling out her camera to document the phenomenon. "Especially in sedimentary rock like this. Wind and water wear away softer layers while leaving harder layers intact, creating features that can appear purposeful even though they're completely natural." I started photographing while she examined the rock composition, taking samples and making notes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these faces weren't natural. The detail was too precise, the expressions too uniform, and there was something about the way they were arranged, not scattered randomly across the wall, but grouped, almost like they were clustered together in groups of 4 or 5. As I moved around the chamber to get different angles, I realized something else. The faces seemed to be watching me. I'd positioned myself for a shot, and the faces in that section would appear to be looking directly at my camera. I'd move to a different position, and they'd still be looking at me, their eyes following. I knew it was probably just an optical illusion, a trick of the light and shadows, but it made my skin crawl. "Professor," I said, "do these faces seem to be tracking your movement at all?" She looked up from her sample collection. "That's just the way the shadows fall when you change the light source position. It creates an illusion of movement or attention." But she didn't sound entirely convinced. And when she turned back to her work, I saw her glance at the nearest faces with an expression that suggested she'd noticed it too. We worked in the chamber for maybe 40 minutes, photographing and documenting everything. The temperature was noticeably cooler than outside, and there was a smell I couldn't quite identify. Not decay exactly, but something organic and old. As we prepared to leave, I took one final panoramic shot of the chamber, wanting to capture the full scope of the faces on the walls. That's when I saw it in my camera screen. In the shadows at the far edge of the chamber, barely visible in the ambient light from our flashlights, there was a shape, tall, roughly human-sized, standing motionless against the wall. I lowered my camera and looked with my naked eyes. Nothing, just shadows and rock. I raised the camera again and looked through the screen. The shape was there, definitely there, not moving, but present, distinct enough that I could see it wasn't just a rock formation or a shadow. "Professor," I said quietly, "we need to leave. Now." Something in my voice made her look up sharply. "What's wrong?" "There's something in here with us. In the shadows, back there." I gestured with my camera toward the far wall. She turned her flashlight in that direction. The beam illuminated nothing but bare rock and more of those screaming faces. No figure, no shape, nothing. "I don't see anything," she said. "It's in my camera. Look." I showed her the screen. The shape was still there, clearer now that I was focusing on it. Definitely human-sized. Definitely not natural. Professor Kwan's expression changed. She'd seen it too. "Let's go," she said, already moving toward the exit. We left quickly, not quite running but moving faster than the terrain really allowed. We didn't speak until we were outside, back in the sunlight and open air. "What was that?" I asked. "I don't know. Some kind of optical artifact in your camera's sensor, probably, or a shadow we didn't account for." But she didn't sound convinced. She sounded shaken. We hiked back to the truck in silence, both of us processing what we'd seen or what I'd seen through my camera screen. When we got back to Regina that evening, I downloaded the photos immediately. The faces were there in every shot, exactly as I remembered them. Screaming mouths, deep-set eyes, arranged in groups across the chamber walls. But they weren't in the same positions I remembered. In my memory, there had been a cluster of 5 faces near the entrance. In the photos, that cluster was near the back. Another group I distinctly remembered being on the left wall appeared on the right in the images. The faces had moved, or my memory was completely wrong, or something else was happening that I couldn't explain. And in that final panoramic shot, the figure was there, partially obscured by shadow, but visible. Tall, thin, standing against the far wall. I enhanced the image as much as I could without destroying the detail. The figure had a vaguely human shape but was wrong somehow. Too tall, or too thin, or both. And it was definitely watching us. The darker area where its face should be was oriented toward where I'd been standing when I took the photo. I called Professor Kwan and sent her the images. She called me back an hour later. "Those faces aren't in the positions I remember either," she said. "And I see the figure. I don't know what to make of it. Should we report it to the university, to someone? And tell them what? That we found caves with faces in the rock and maybe saw something that might have been a shadow?" She paused. "I'm going to do some research on the area, on its history. There might be something that explains this." I did my own research. The Big Muddy Badlands had been used as an outlaw hideout from roughly 1870 to 1900. The most famous was Dutch Henry, a horse thief who'd operated out of the Badlands for years before being caught and hanged in Montana. But there had been dozens of others men who'd used the caves and coulees to hide from law enforcement, from rival gangs, from anyone looking for them. I found newspaper articles from the 1880s and 90s. Articles about Pazes, tracking outlaws into the Badlands and finding nothing. Articles about shootouts between rival gangs that left multiple men dead. Articles about outlaws who disappeared into the Badlands and were never seen again, presumed dead but never confirmed. I found an estimate in a historical society publication that at least 40 outlaws had been killed in the Big Muddy Badlands between 1,870 and 1,900. Most of them had been buried in unmarked graves, if they were buried at all. Some had been left where they fell, their bodies eventually consumed by scavengers or weather. The Badlands had a reputation for being haunted long before I'd ever set foot there. Professor Kwan found something else. A reference in a frontier journal from 1887, written by a territorial marshal who'd tracked a gang into the Badlands. He wrote about finding caves with strange markings on the walls. He described them as the faces of the damned, screaming their eternal torment into stone. He wrote that his men had refused to enter the caves, claimed they could hear voices coming from inside. The marshal had dismissed it as superstition, but he'd made a note of the location. I cross-referenced his description with our GPS coordinates. We'd been in the same caves, the same chamber, looking at the same faces that a marshal had described over 130 years ago. This doesn't make sense, Professor Kwan said when we met to discuss our findings. Those faces can't have been there in 1887. The erosion patterns we documented are recent decades old at most, not over a century. Unless they weren't formed by erosion, I said. She looked at me sharply. Don't start with supernatural explanations. There's always a rational answer. But neither of us could find one. The faces shouldn't exist. The figure in my photograph shouldn't exist. The fact that a marshal in 1887 had seen the same things we'd seen shouldn't be possible if those faces were natural erosion patterns that formed in the last few decades. Professor Kwan said she wanted to go back, wanted to take more samples, do more detailed analysis. But when I pressed her to schedule another trip, she kept finding reasons to delay. Eventually, she admitted she didn't want to go back. That something about those caves had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain, and she decided to focus her research on other formations in the Badlands. I haven't been back either. But I think about those caves constantly, about the faces screaming silently from the walls, about the figure standing in the shadows, watching us with whatever passed for eyes, about 40 dead outlaws buried in unmarked graves or left to rot where they fell, their bodies and bones long since returned to the earth. I think they're still there. Not their physical remains, those are gone, scattered, absorbed, but something else, something that got trapped in those caves, in that chamber, pressed into the rock itself by violence and death, and the desperate desire to not be forgotten. The faces aren't erosion patterns, they're impressions, memories. The last expressions of men who died badly in a place where no one would find them, where no one would remember them. And that figure in my photograph wasn't a shadow or an optical artifact. It was one of them, one of the 40 dead outlaws, still hiding in those caves, still watching for the law or rival gangs or anyone who might threaten them, still trapped in the moment of their death, unable to leave, unable to do anything but watch and wait and scream silently from walls of stone. Professor Kwan destroyed her samples. She told me she'd ruined them in processing, but I know she didn't. She threw them away because she didn't want any physical connection to that place. I've archived my photographs, but I don't look at them. I don't want to see those faces again. Don't want to see that figure. Don't want to be reminded that there are places where violence leaves marks that last longer than bones, where the dead don't rest because they can't, because something in their dying trapped them forever in the place where they fell. The Big Muddy Badlands is still there. The caves are still there. The faces are still there, screaming into the darkness. And if you're foolish enough to go inside, if you're brave or stupid enough to enter that chamber and shine your light on those walls, you'll see them too. And they'll see you. They'll watch you with stone eyes that somehow move. And if you're very unlucky, if you look at just the right angle, you'll see the figure in the shadows, still hiding, still waiting, still angry about dying alone and forgotten in a place where nobody would ever look. and you'll leave. You'll leave quickly, telling yourself it was just pareidolia, just natural rock formations, just your imagination. But you'll know better. You'll know that some places hold on to death, that some violence doesn't fade, that some of the dead stay angry forever. You'll know, and you'll never go back. I started the summer of 2023 as a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Saskatchewan, working on a project at the Avonlea archaeological site. The site is famous in archaeological circles as one of the most significant buffalo jump locations in North America, with evidence of indigenous hunting practices going back thousands of years. Our team was there to continue excavation work in a section that hadn't been properly surveyed since the 1960s, updating previous findings with modern techniques and technology. The site sits in the rolling prairie about 20 kilometers from the town of Avonlea, in an area that still feels isolated despite being relatively close to civilization. The land is owned by a rancher who'd been cooperative with the university for decades, allowing researchers access to what he recognized as an important piece of history. We'd set up our base camp near the main excavation area, a collection of tents and equipment that would be our home for 6 weeks. I was 3 weeks into the dig when we found the chamber. We'd been excavating a grid section that previous researchers had marked as low priority in their notes, an area where initial surveys had suggested nothing of particular interest. But as we dug down through layers of prairie soil and ancient deposits, we hit something unexpected: worked stone. Not natural rock formations, but stones that had been deliberately placed and arranged. Dr. Patricia Chen, our lead archaeologist, immediately halted work and called everyone over. "This isn't part of the Buffalo Jump complex," she said, kneeling to examine the stones more closely. "This is something else, something that's not in any of the previous reports." We spent the next 2 days carefully excavating around the stones, revealing what appeared to be a chamber approximately 8 feet deep and 12 feet across, lined with stones that had been fitted together with considerable skill. The chamber had been deliberately concealed, covered with layers of soil and prairie grass that had taken decades to accumulate. When we finally cleared enough to see inside, we found the bones. Human bones. 12 skeletons, arranged in a circle around the perimeter of the chamber, all facing inward toward the center. They were seated, or had been when they died, their backs against the stone walls. The bones were in remarkably good condition, protected by the chamber's construction from the elements and from scavengers. Dr. Chen immediately stopped all work and called in specialists from the university and from the provincial coroner's office. What they found made no sense for the site's history. The bones dated to the 1880s, recent in archaeological terms, not the ancient remains we'd expected. And with the bones were artifacts that seemed completely out of place. Medical journals written in English, their pages preserved by the dry conditions inside the chamber. Medical instruments, scalpels, syringes, glass vessels for bloodletting, and dozens of small glass bottles, all with labels from the Whitmore Pharmaceutical Company, an outfit that, according to quick research, had gone bankrupt in 1889. The specialists brought in an historian from the provincial archives and a medical anthropologist to help interpret what we'd found. Over the next week, as they carefully documented everything, a disturbing story emerged from the journals. The journals belonged to a Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a physician who'd operated in Western Canada in the 1880s. He'd become obsessed with finding a cure for tuberculosis, which was epidemic among indigenous populations at the time, killing entire communities. His journals detailed his belief that he'd discovered such a cure, a combination of herbal remedies he'd learned from indigenous medicine men, combined with aggressive bloodletting and compounds of his own creation. He'd somehow convinced a group of sick people, the journals referred to them only as subjects, never by name, to undergo his treatment. He'd brought them to this remote location, away from their communities, promising them a cure. The journals documented his treatment protocol in clinical detail: the bloodletting, the administration of his compounds, the progression of symptoms, the growing desperation as his treatments not only failed to cure them, but seemed to accelerate their decline. All 12 had died. The journals ended abruptly, with no explanation of what Dr. Whitmore had done afterward, where he'd gone, or whether he'd faced any consequences. The final entry simply read, "All subjects deceased. Treatment protocol ineffective. Chamber sealed. May God forgive my errors." The discovery made headlines. Indigenous leaders were contacted immediately, and representatives from several First Nations came to the site to oversee the proper handling of the remains. The story was one of medical experimentation without consent, of Indigenous people suffering from a deadly disease being used as test subjects by a doctor who'd had no real understanding of what he was doing, who'd killed them with his arrogance and his certainty that his methods were correct. The remains were handled with the respect they deserved. Ceremonies were performed. Plans were made for proper burial at a location chosen by the Indigenous leaders. The site was to be sealed permanently, with the chamber filled in and the location marked but left undisturbed. But before that happened, I went back alone. It was stupid and disrespectful, and I knew it even as I was doing it. But I needed to understand something I couldn't articulate, something about the chamber and what had happened there that had been eating at me since we'd made the discovery. I went at night, 3 days before the burial ceremonies were scheduled. The site was closed, the excavation covered with tarps, but I had keys to the equipment shed, and I knew the ranch owner wasn't patrolling regularly. I brought a flashlight and climbed down into the chamber, which had been fully excavated and documented but not yet filled in. The bones had been removed, taken for analysis and preparation for burial. The artifacts had been cataloged and sent to various institutions. The chamber was empty except for the stone walls and the dirt floor, and the disturbing sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the space itself. I stood there in the center of the circle where 12 people had died, where they'd sat against the walls and coughed up blood and felt their lungs failing, while a doctor they'd trusted administered treatments that only made things worse. I thought about their last days, their pain, their growing realization that they weren't going to be cured, that they were going to die in this stone chamber far from their families and communities. That's when I heard it. Coughing. Wet, painful, the sound of lungs filled with fluid. It came from beneath my feet, from underground, from the earth itself. Not one person coughing, but several, overlapping, creating a terrible chorus of suffering. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, looking for a source. There was nothing. Just me in an empty stone chamber, 8 feet underground. But the coughing continued, growing louder, more desperate. I could hear the struggle for breath, the panic of drowning in your own body's fluids, the wet rattle that meant death was close. And underneath the coughing, barely audible, was a voice, or voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand, possibly Cree, possibly Saulteaux, possibly something else. I couldn't make out the words, but I understood the tone. Anger, betrayal, agony that hadn't ended with death, that had somehow been trapped in this chamber along with the bones, that was still present even though the physical remains had been removed. The voice grew louder, more insistent, rising above the sounds of coughing and dying. I still couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, felt the accusation, felt the rage of people who'd been promised healing and given death instead, who'd been experimented on like they were laboratory animals rather than human beings, who'd died alone and in agony while their families searched for them, not knowing where they'd gone or what had happened to them. I climbed out of that chamber faster than I'd ever climbed anything in my life. I drove straight back to the university, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done, didn't mention the sounds I'd heard. I just showed up for the burial ceremonies 3 days later and stood silently while Indigenous elders performed the proper rites and the remains were finally laid to rest in a location that would remain confidential, known only to the families and communities they'd been taken from. The Avonlea site has been sealed. The chamber has been filled in, covered over, returned to prairie grass and sage. The artifacts are in various institutions, available for research, but not on public display, out of respect for the people who died. Dr. Whitmore's journals are in the provincial archives, a testament to the medical abuses that Indigenous people suffered in the name of science and progress. But the coughing hasn't stopped. I hear it sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, that wet, painful sound of tuberculosis victims drowning in their own lungs. And underneath it, that voice speaking in a language I don't understand, but with a tone I recognize. Anger that hasn't faded, betrayal that hasn't been forgiven, pain that somehow continues even after 140 years, even after proper burial, even after acknowledgement of the wrong that was done. I've tried to research Dr. Marcus Whitmore to find out what happened to him after he sealed that chamber and walked away from 12 bodies. I found almost nothing. He appears in medical registry lists until 1889, practicing in various locations across Western Canada. Then he vanishes from the record. No death certificate, no further medical registration, no pension records or property holdings. He just stopped existing on paper. One historical society volunteer found a reference to a doctor matching his description who'd been found dead in Montana in 1891, identified only by medical instruments in his possession. The cause of death was listed as consumption tuberculosis. He'd died coughing up blood, drowning in his own lungs, suffering the same death he'd inflicted on his 12 test subjects. I don't know if that's justice. I don't know if dying of the disease he'd claimed to cure somehow balanced what he'd done to those 12 people. But I think about it. I think about him in his final hours, feeling his lungs failing, knowing what was happening, maybe remembering those 12 people who died the same way because they'd trusted him to heal them. I changed my graduate program focus after that summer. I'm no longer working on archaeological sites. I couldn't continue, not after what I'd heard in that chamber, not after understanding that some violations leave marks that don't fade, that some suffering doesn't end with death, that some anger is justified and eternal. The official story is that we discovered evidence of medical experimentation conducted without consent in the 1880s, that we reported it to appropriate authorities, that the remains were properly handled and buried with full ceremony. That's all true, but it's not complete. The complete story includes the sounds I heard that night, the coughing that still echoes from a chamber that's been filled in and sealed, the voices speaking in anger and anguish, demanding acknowledgement, demanding justice, demanding something that I don't know how to give them even if I wanted to. Indigenous leaders I spoke with afterward, very carefully, without mentioning what I'd experienced, told me that land remembers, that places where terrible things happened hold on to those events, echo them, replay them for people who are sensitive enough to hear. They told me that the 12 people who died in that chamber had been taken from their communities without proper procedure, without consent from their families. That doctor, Whitmore, had essentially kidnapped them under the guise of offering treatment. Their families had searched for them, had mourned them, had never known what happened until our excavation finally revealed the truth. One elder told me that the proper burial rites might help the spirits find peace, but that the land itself would remember for generations. That the anger would fade eventually, but slowly, over decades or centuries. That places where indigenous people suffered at the hands of colonizers and their science were scattered across the prairie, marked only by the pain that refused to dissipate. I think about that chamber sometimes, about those 12 people sitting in a circle, facing inward, coughing and dying while a doctor took notes and administered treatments that were killing them. I think about their families, not knowing where they'd gone, what had happened, whether they were alive or dead. I think about the decades they spent buried in that concealed chamber, while buffalo jumps were excavated nearby and archaeologists walked past without knowing they were there. And I think about that night when I climbed down into the empty chamber and heard them, still coughing, still dying, still angry, still trapped somehow in the moment of their deaths, in the betrayal of being promised healing and given poison instead. The site is sealed now. Prairie grass grows over where the chamber was. Cattle graze there like they graze everywhere else on the ranch. Nothing marks the spot except GPS coordinates in university archives and the memory of a few dozen people who were there for the excavation and the ceremonies. But the coughing continues. I hear it. I hear it late at night when everything is quiet. I hear it, and I remember 12 people who trusted a doctor who didn't deserve their trust, who died alone and in agony, who were buried in secret and forgotten for over a century. And I hear the voice beneath the coughing, still speaking in a language I don't understand, but with a meaning that's crystal clear. Anger that will never fade, pain that will never heal, a demand for acknowledgement, for justice, for remembrance that will echo across generations until someone finally figures out how to give them peace. I don't think I'll ever stop hearing it. I don't think I should. Some things shouldn't be forgotten. Some suffering deserves to be remembered. Some anger is righteous and should echo forever, a reminder of what was done and what should never be done again. The chamber is sealed. The bodies are properly buried. The story is told. But the coughing continues, and it should. It should continue until everyone knows what happened there, until everyone understands the cost of treating human beings as experimental subjects, until the memory of those 12 people is honored not just with ceremony, but with genuine change in how we approach medicine, consent, and the treatment of indigenous peoples. Until then, the coughing continues. And I listen. It's the least I can do, to witness, to remember, to ensure that their suffering, their deaths, their anger doesn't fade into historical footnotes and archive journals. They deserve to be heard, even if hearing them means I'll never sleep peacefully again. Even if it means carrying their coughing with me forever, a reminder of what humans are capable of doing to each other in the name of progress and science, and the arrogant certainty that we know better than the people we're supposed to be helping. The Avonlea site is closed, but the story isn't finished. It won't be finished until those 12 voices finally fall silent, until they finally find whatever peace might be possible after a century and a half of rage and pain and betrayed trust. I don't think I'll live to see that day. I don't think anyone alive now will, but I hope it comes eventually. I hope they find rest. I hope they find peace. But until then, I listen, and I remember, and I tell their story to anyone who will hear it. It's the only thing I know how to do. My grandmother died in February 2019, 3 weeks after her 94th birthday. She'd lived in Lucky Lake her entire life, in the same house my great-grandfather had built in 1947. I was her only grandchild, and the house fell to me along with everything in it. I drove out from Saskatchewan in early March to start the process of cleaning it out, deciding what to keep and what to donate or discard. Lucky Lake is one of those Saskatchewan towns that's been slowly dying for decades. What was once a thriving agricultural community of over 300 people had dwindled to maybe 250 by the time my grandmother died. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the general store still operates but half the buildings on Main Street are empty, where the young people leave as soon as they're old enough and rarely come back. The house was exactly as she'd left it. My grandmother had been in the hospital for her final week, and in the chaos of her death and the funeral, no one had been back to disturb anything. I spent the first day just walking through rooms, remembering. Her kitchen with its ancient appliances, her living room with the furniture that had been there since I was a child, her bedroom with photographs on every surface, a life documented in faces that were mostly unfamiliar to me, people from generations I'd never known. In the hallway, mounted on the wall near what had been her bedroom, I found the phone. It was an old rotary phone, avocado green, the kind I associated with the 1970s. The cord ran to a wall jack that looked original to the house. On a whim, I picked up the receiver. I expected nothing. The service should have been disconnected when she died, months ago. But there was a dial tone, clear and steady, exactly like a phone should sound. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number from the rotary phone. My cell rang. The connection was perfect, no static, no delay. I stood there in that hallway, holding two phones, listening to my own ringtone, trying to understand how this was possible. The phone service should have been cut off. SaskTel should have disconnected her number. But somehow, the line was still active. I called SaskTel the next day. The customer service representative checked my grandmother's account and confirmed what I already knew. Service had been terminated on the 12th of February 2019, the day after her death. The number had been reassigned. There was no active service at that address. When I told him I had a dial tone and had successfully made calls, he said that was impossible. Old phones sometimes hold a charge that creates the illusion of a dial tone, he explained, but they can't actually connect to the network without active service. I didn't argue. I just thanked him and hung up. But I knew what I'd experienced. That phone worked. It was connected to something, even if it wasn't the modern telephone network. That night, I stayed in the house instead of driving back to Saskatoon. I'd cleaned out most of the kitchen, boxed up photographs, started the long process of sorting a life into keep, donate, and throw away. Around 11 o'clock, I was sitting in the living room, exhausted, when I heard voices, faint, coming from the hallway. I thought at first that I'd left a radio on somewhere, but the voices were too clear, too distinct. They were coming from the phone. I walked to the hallway and picked up the receiver. The dial tone was gone. In its place were voices. Two women, talking about someone named Dorothy and her new baby. They discussed the baby's weight, 8 pounds and 3 ounces, and how Dorothy had had a difficult delivery but was recovering well. They talked about bringing her a casserole, about organizing a visit, about how pleased Dorothy's husband Frank must be. The conversation was completely normal, completely ordinary, except that the cadence was wrong, the references were wrong, The whole tone of it felt like it came from another era. I listened for maybe 5 minutes before one of the women said she had to go, had to get supper on the table. They said goodbye and the line went quiet. I sat on the floor in that hallway for a long time, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to silence and trying to rationalize what I just heard. Old recordings somehow playing through the line, a cross signal picking up an historical documentary. Something, anything, that made sense. The next night, I stayed again. I told myself it was because I had more work to do on the house, but really, I was waiting for the voices. They came around the same time, 11 o'clock. Different people this time. 2 men talking about crop prices, about how wheat was down and barley was holding steady, about whether it was worth planting durum this year or sticking with the regular varieties. They discussed it with the intensity of people whose livelihoods depended on these decisions. Then they moved on to other topics. Local gossip. Someone's son had gotten into trouble in Regina. Someone else's daughter was getting married. Normal conversation, the kind of thing neighbors share over a fence or on a phone line. I started recording the conversations. I set up my phone to capture the audio, held it near the receiver, and documented everything. Over the next week, I recorded maybe 10 hours of conversations. Different voices, different topics, but all with that same quality of coming from another time. The references were consistently dated prices and products, and cultural touchstones from the 1950s and early 1960s. Names I didn't recognize. Events I'd have to look up. When I got back to Saskatoon, I spent days in the provincial archives and the library, cross-referencing what I'd heard. I found Dorothy in the Lucky Lake records, Dorothy Christensen, who'd given birth to a son named Michael on the 14th of June, 1953. I found Frank, her husband, a farmer who'd worked land just outside town. I found the 2 women whose voices I'd first heard, Edith Carlson and Ruth Mitchell, neighbors who'd been close friends and who both appeared in local records until their deaths in the 1980s. Every conversation I'd recorded could be traced to real people, people who'd lived in Lucky Lake in the 1950s and early 1960s, people who were all dead now, who'd been dead for decades in some cases. But their conversations remained, somehow, still playing on a phone line that shouldn't exist, on what Saskatchewan used to call a party line. Party lines were common in rural areas until the 1990s. Multiple households shared a single line, and you could pick up your phone and hear your neighbors' conversations if they were on a call. Privacy was minimal. Everyone knew everyone else's business. The system was outdated and was gradually replaced as telephone technology improved, until finally the last party lines in Saskatchewan were disconnected in the late 1990s. But my grandmother's phone was still connected to one, or to something that functioned like one, because the conversations I was hearing weren't just recordings. They were interactive. They responded to each other, followed natural patterns of discussion, included silences and interruptions and all the irregular rhythms of real human speech. On my next visit to Lucky Lake, I did something I knew was probably stupid. I waited for the voices to start, and when I heard people talking, I tried to join the conversation. I waited for a pause and spoke into the receiver. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The talking stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, a man's voice came through, confused and slightly irritated. "Who is this? You're not on this line." "My name is David. I'm calling from my grandmother's house in Lucky Lake." "Which grandmother?" "You'll need to be more specific, son. Half the town's related to each other." I gave him my grandmother's name, Agnes Novak. There was a pause, then a different voice, a woman's voice, older and sharper. "Agnes Novak, Martin's daughter? She can't be old enough to have grandchildren. She's barely 18. My grandmother had been 18 in 1943. These people, whoever or whatever they were living in a time before I was born, before my parents were born. I tried to explain, tried to tell them what year it was, but the more I talked, the more agitated they became. Finally, one of the men told me to get off the line, that I was clearly confused or playing some kind of prank, and they'd report me to the operator if I didn't stop interfering with their calls. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark hallway, holding a phone that shouldn't work, that had just connected me to people who'd been dead for decades. I tried again several times over the next few weeks. Sometimes I'd get through, sometimes just static. The few times I managed to have something resembling a conversation, the people on the other end were always confused by my presence, always living in a time that had passed decades ago. One woman asked me what year it was. I told her it was 2024. She went quiet for a long moment. Then I heard her crying. Soft, heartbroken crying. "That's not possible," she said. "It's 1959. It's spring. My daughter's getting married in June. That's not, you're lying." Then she hung up, or disconnected, or whatever the equivalent was on a line that existed outside normal time. I started researching the technology, trying to understand what was happening. Party lines worked through central switching stations that connected multiple households to a shared circuit. When you picked up your phone, you could hear anyone else who was currently using that circuit. The system required human operators initially, then automated switching equipment, all of which had been replaced decades ago with modern digital systems. But what if a party line had somehow never been properly disconnected? What if the circuit had remained active, preserved in some way, continuing to function long after it should have been dismantled? And what if the conversations from 50 years ago had somehow been recorded, not digitally, but in the electrical systems themselves, playing back endlessly to anyone who could access the line? Except that didn't explain the interactions. Didn't explain how the people on the other end could hear me, could respond to me, could ask questions and react to my answers. Recordings don't do that. Recordings are fixed, unchanging. What I was experiencing was something else. I found records of my grandmother's phone service going back to 1947. She'd been on a party line with 5 other households until 1987, when the system was finally upgraded and everyone got individual lines. I found the names of the other households: the Christiansens, the Carlsons, the Mitchells, the Beaumonts, the Kowalskis. All families I'd heard on the recordings, all people who'd lived in Lucky Lake during those years when party lines were normal and everyone knew everyone else's business. I wondered if they knew they were dead, if they understood that the conversations they were having, the plans they were making, the futures they were discussing, had all happened and ended decades ago. Or if they were trapped in some kind of loop, reliving the same years over and over, unaware that time had moved on without them. The last time I picked up that phone was in October 2023. I'd been avoiding the house, avoiding the phone, trying to pretend it didn't exist, but I had to go back to finish settling the estate, to make final decisions about selling the property. I arrived late on a Friday evening, exhausted from the drive, and heard the phone ringing as I unlocked the door. I stood in the dark hallway and listened to it ring. 5 times, 6, 7. Finally, I picked up. "Agnes?" A man's voice, elderly, uncertain. "Agnes, is that you?" "No, Agnes died. This is her grandson." Silence. Then quietly, "Died. She's..." "When?" 2019, in February." "I see." A long pause. "What year is it now?" "Landsenling Archesi." That's 62 years. She would have been." He trailed off, doing the math. 94. She lived a long time." "She did. Did you know her?" "Everyone knew Agnes. This is Michael. Michael Christensen. I grew up 3 houses down from her." I looked him up later. Michael Christensen had died in 2007, at age 54, from a heart attack. But on that phone line, he was still alive, still living in whatever year his consciousness was trapped in, still able to somehow connect across decades to a grandson he'd never met. "Michael, do you understand what's happening? Where you are?" "I'm home, in Lucky Lake." On the phone. "I don't. I'm having trouble remembering. What day is it?" "It's October 2024. "That's not right. It's spring. It's always spring. I'm waiting for..." He sounded confused now, frightened. "I can't remember what I'm waiting for." "Why can't I remember?" I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to someone that they're dead, that they've been dead for years, that they're somehow trapped in a phone line having the same conversations over and over with other dead people? "Michael, I think you should hang up. I think you should rest." "I'm tired," he said. "I've been so tired, but I can't sleep. Every time I try, the phone rings. Someone needs to talk. Someone always needs to talk. You can stop answering. You can rest now." "Can I?" He sounded hopeful, like I'd offered him something he'd been desperately wanting but didn't know he could have. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. You can rest." "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Agnes's grandson. Tell her I'm glad she lived a long life. Tell her we all missed her when she moved away." My grandmother had never moved away. She'd lived in Lucky Lake until the day she died. But in whatever time Michael was experiencing, maybe she had left. Maybe to him, her death or her aging, or her simply living into a different era, registered as her moving away, as her leaving the party line that connected him to everyone he knew. "I'll tell her," I said. The line went dead. I haven't picked up that phone since. I had it disconnected physically this time, cutting the cord, removing the jack from the wall. I sold the house 6 months later to a young couple from Moose Jaw who were looking for affordable property. I didn't tell them about the phone. I didn't tell them about the voices. I just sold them the house and wished them well and drove away. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that party line, about the people trapped on it, living in a perpetual 1950s or early 1960s, having the same conversations, making the same plans, living lives that ended decades ago, but somehow continue in electrical signals and shared circuits. I think about Michael Christensen, who sounded so tired, who just wanted permission to stop answering the phone. I wonder if he found rest. I wonder if he's still there, still trapped on that line, still having conversations with neighbors who are just as dead as he is. I wonder if the new owners of my grandmother's house will find the phone line somehow still active. We'll pick it up one night and hear voices from the past. We'll have to decide whether to engage with something that shouldn't exist. And I wonder about my grandmother, who lived in that house for 72 years, who must have known about the voices on the party line, who never mentioned it to anyone. Did she talk to them sometimes? Did she pick up the phone late at night and chat with people she'd known as a girl? People who were still young on that preserved circuit while she grew old in the real world? The phone is disconnected now. The house is sold. The line should be dead, but I don't think it is. I think somewhere in Lucky Lake, there's still a party line running, still connecting households that don't exist anymore, still carrying conversations between people who died decades ago and don't know it yet, still ringing, late at night, waiting for someone to pick up and join the conversation, still trying to connect the living and the dead, the past and the present, the world that was and the world that is, still hoping, maybe, that someone will answer and tell them it's okay to rest, that they can stop talking now, that they can finally, after all these years, hang up and move on. But I don't think anyone will. I think that party line will keep operating, keep connecting, keep carrying those voices forward through time, until the last physical remnant of the system finally fails, until the wires corrode and the circuits break, and the whole impossible thing finally collapses into the silence it should have reached decades ago. And even then, I'm not sure it will stop, because some connections run deeper than wire and electricity. Some conversations don't end just because one or both parties are dead. Some party lines keep running because the people on them aren't ready to admit that their time is over, that the world has moved on, that the lives they're living exist only in memory and electrical echoes. The phone is disconnected, but sometimes I still hear it ringing. In my dreams, in quiet moments. A rotary phone in an empty house in Lucky Lake, calling out to anyone who'll listen, trying to connect one more time, trying to share one more piece of news, one more bit of gossip, one more normal conversation between neighbors who've been dead for longer than I've been alive. I never answer, but I hear it, and I know I always will. I've been a structural engineer for 15 years, specializing in heritage building assessment. Most of my work involves determining whether old structures can be saved or if they've deteriorated beyond repair. In the summer of 2022, I was contracted by the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation to assess a series of grain elevators across the province, deciding which ones were stable enough to preserve as historical landmarks and which needed to be demolished before they collapsed on their own. Horizon was near the end of my list. It's barely a town anymore, maybe 20 people, most of them elderly, living in houses that are slowly falling apart around them. The grain elevator was the only structure still standing from what had once been a thriving agricultural hub. Built in 1952, it had operated until 2003, when the rail line was abandoned and the grain company went bankrupt. Since then, it had stood empty, a 70-foot wooden tower slowly weathering into ruin. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July. The elevator dominated the flat prairie landscape, visible from miles away, its faded red paint and white lettering still legible against the sky. Up close, the deterioration was obvious: warped boards, missing panels, a door that hung crooked on rusted hinges. But the structure was still standing, which suggested the bones were solid enough that preservation might be possible. I spent the first 2 hours doing exterior assessments, photographing, taking measurements, noting areas of concern. The foundation was concrete, cracked but intact. The main support beams were massive timbers that showed some rot but weren't compromised. The bins section looked stable. Overall, my initial impression was positive. This elevator could potentially be saved with significant investment. The interior was another matter. I climbed the internal ladders carefully, testing each rung before putting weight on it, working my way up through the levels. The ground floor had been stripped of equipment years ago. The second floor still had some of the original grain handling machinery, rusted and seized but intact. The third floor was the working level, where grain had been sorted and directed into the bins below. I was taking measurements of the structural timbers when I noticed something odd about the wall. There was a seam that didn't match the construction elsewhere, a section that looked like it had been added later, built from different lumber and with different joinery. I pressed against it and felt it shift slightly, not loose, but not solid either, like there was empty space behind it. I found a pry bar in my equipment bag and worked the edge of the seam. The false wall was well made but not permanent, designed to look like part of the original structure but actually removable. It took me maybe 10 minutes to create an opening large enough to see through. Behind the wall was a room, maybe 10 feet square, completely enclosed except for the opening I just created. I shone my flashlight inside. A chair, wooden and simple, a cot with a stained mattress, and the walls were covered in tally marks. Thousands of them, scratched into the wood with something sharp, covering every surface from floor to ceiling. Groups of 5, the traditional way of counting. I did a rough estimate and stopped when I reached over 3,000 marks. The smell hit me then, old and organic and wrong. Not the smell of grain dust or wood rot or even the usual decay you find in abandoned buildings. This was something else, something that made my stomach turn and my instincts scream at me to leave. But I'm a professional. I document, I investigate. So I climbed through the opening into the room, my flashlight beam sweeping across those endless tally marks. There was a small pile of refuse in one corner: food wrappers, empty water jugs, all decades old by the look of them. And under the cot, I found a notebook. It was water-stained and mildewed, but the writing inside was still legible. The first entry was dated the 14th of March, 1976. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the kind of writing you'd expect from someone educated and careful. The author identified himself in that first entry: Peter Novak, elevator operator, documenting what he called the situation. He wrote about an accident. On the 3rd of March 1976, his co-worker Daniel Reimer had fallen into one of the grain bins. The bins were 40 feet deep, and when they're full, grain behaves like quicksand. You sink, you suffocate, you die within minutes. Peter had called for help, but by the time they'd managed to empty enough grain to reach Daniel, it was too late. They'd pulled out his body 3 hours after he fell. Peter wrote that Daniel's eyes had been open, filled with grain, and that his hands were shredded from trying to dig his way out. The funeral was on March 7. Peter wrote that he'd attended, that he'd spoken to Daniel's widow, that he'd tried to explain that it had happened so fast that there was nothing anyone could have done, but he didn't believe his own words. He kept thinking about those 3 hours, about Daniel buried in grain, still alive for some of that time, calling for help that couldn't reach him. Then the sound started. Peter wrote about hearing scratching from inside the bins, scraping, like fingernails on metal. He'd investigate, find nothing, tell himself it was grain settling, or mice, or his imagination. But the sounds continued, and then he heard breathing, heavy, labored breathing, like someone struggling for air, coming from the bins, from the place where Daniel had died. The entries became increasingly erratic. Peter wrote about searching the bins, convinced Daniel was still down there somehow, still alive, still trying to dig his way out. He'd work all day, then spend his nights with a flashlight, climbing into the bins, sifting through grain by hand, looking for something. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly. The handwriting deteriorated from neat to shaky to barely legible. In November, he wrote about hearing Daniel's voice, calling his name, asking why Peter hadn't helped him, why he'd let him suffocate, why he'd abandoned him down there in the dark. Peter knew it wasn't real, wrote that he understood he was probably having a breakdown, but he couldn't stop searching, couldn't stop believing that somehow Daniel was still there, still trapped, still waiting for rescue. The final entry was dated the 18th of December 1976. Peter wrote that he'd built a room on the 3rd floor, behind a false wall, where he could wait, where he could count the days and listen and know when Daniel was finally free. He wrote that he couldn't leave the elevator, couldn't abandon his post, couldn't fail Daniel again. The entry ended mid-sentence. I hear him now, closer than before. I think he's almost... I stood in that room with the journal in my hands, surrounded by tally marks that represented months of counting, of waiting, of a man slowly losing his mind in a self-imposed prison. I did the math. March 14 to December 18 was roughly 280 days. There were over 3,000 tally marks on those walls. Peter had been in this room for years, not months. Or he'd been counting something else, something I didn't want to think about. I left the room and the elevator as quickly as I could. Back at my hotel that night, I started researching. I found Peter Novak in old grain company employment records. He'd worked at the Horizon elevator from 1972 until his disappearance in December 1976. I found Daniel Reimer's obituary, died the 3rd of March 1976 in a workplace accident, survived by his wife Margaret and 2 young children. And I found a missing persons report for Peter Novak, filed by his sister in January 1977. He'd simply vanished. His car was found at the elevator. His apartment had been left as if he'd just stepped out, but Peter himself was never found. The investigation concluded he'd likely left town voluntarily, possibly suffering from trauma related to witnessing his co-worker's death. But I knew where Peter had gone. I knew he'd locked himself in that hidden room and waited, counting days on the walls, listening for sounds that might or might not have been real, slowly starving or dying of thirst, or just giving up while the grain elevator continued operating around him, workers coming and going, never knowing there was a man dying behind a false wall on the 3rd floor. I submitted my report to the Heritage Foundation. I recommended demolition. The structure was too deteriorated, I wrote, and the cost of restoration would be prohibitive. I didn't mention the hidden room or the journal. I just wanted the elevator torn down, wanted that space where Peter Novak had counted his last days erased from existence. The demolition was scheduled for October. I contracted a crew out of Regina, and I went with them. I needed to see it finished, needed to watch that building come down. But before the demolition, I asked the crew to help me check the bins one more time. I needed to know if Peter's search had been futile, or if there was something down there that had driven him mad. We opened each bin carefully, emptying what little grain remained after decades of abandonment. The first 3 bins were empty except for debris and rust. The 4th bin had something at the bottom: bones. Human bones, confirmed by a forensic team I called in against the crew's protests. 2 sets of bones. One was Daniel Reimer, identified through dental records and the work clothes he'd been buried in. But there was a second set, older, the forensic team said, dating back at least to the 1950s, possibly earlier. An adult male, identity unknown, cause of death consistent with suffocation. We searched the remaining bins and found nothing else. Just those 2 sets of bones at the bottom of bin 4, buried in grain that had been loaded and unloaded 1,000 times over the decades, bodies that had somehow remained there through all of it, hidden in the dark at the bottom of a 40-foot metal cylinder. The elevator was demolished on the 15th of October 2022. I watched from a safe distance as the charges went off, as 70 years of history collapsed into rubble and dust. The hidden room was destroyed in the collapse, those thousands of tally marks erased, Peter Novak's prison finally torn down decades too late to save him. Daniel Reimer was properly buried next to his wife, who died in 2001, never knowing what had happened to her husband's body. The second set of bones was buried in Horizon's small cemetery with a marker that read, "Unknown, found 2022. Peter Novak's remains were never found. He's still classified as missing, still officially just a man who walked away from his life in 1976 and was never seen again. But I know what happened to him. I know he locked himself in that room and slowly died there, convinced he was keeping vigil over his coworker, convinced he was waiting for something, and I know the sounds he heard weren't his imagination, because I've heard them too. It started about a month after the demolition. I'd wake up at night hearing scratching sounds, like fingernails on metal, like someone digging through grain. I'd check my house, find nothing, tell myself it was pipes or wind or my heating system. But the sounds continued, always at night, always with that same desperate quality. And then I started hearing the breathing. Heavy, labored, the sound of someone suffocating slowly. I've had my house checked for carbon monoxide, for gas leaks, for anything that might explain it. There's nothing. The sounds aren't real. They can't be real. But I hear them. I hear scratching and breathing, and sometimes, very faintly, I hear a voice, not calling my name, just calling out, wordless, desperate, asking for help that will never come. I think about Peter Novak counting days on a wall, about Daniel Reimer buried in grain, about an unknown man who died the same way decades earlier. I think about how grain elevators are just vertical tombs, designed to hold organic matter in darkness, and how maybe some kinds of death leave impressions that don't fade, that persist in the materials themselves, in the metal and wood and grain. The elevator is gone, the bones have been buried, the hidden room has been demolished, but the sounds continue, and I think they always will. Not just for me, but for anyone who knows the story, who understands what happened in that elevator, who carries the knowledge of Peter Novak's vigil and Daniel Reimer's death. Some buildings shouldn't be preserved. Some places accumulate too much suffering, too much trauma, too much death. They should be torn down and forgotten, their stories lost, their victims released from whatever keeps them trapped. But I don't think the demolition released anything. I think it just spread it out, dispersed it, sent it looking for new places to echo. And now I hear it, scratching, breathing, searching, always searching. For something that's lost, for something that can't be found, for help that's 40 years too late. The Horizon grain elevator is gone, but it's not finished. It will never be finished. Some vigils don't end even when the watchers die. Some searches continue long after the searchers have given up. Some sounds of suffering echo forward through time, looking for anyone who'll listen, anyone who'll understand, anyone who'll finally, impossibly, provide the help that's needed. I hear them searching, and I can't help. None of us can. All we can do is listen and remember and carry their sounds with us into the dark, scratching, breathing, calling out, forever waiting for rescue that will never arrive. I was making the drive from Prince Albert to La Ronge in late January, something I'd done maybe a dozen times over the years. I worked for the provincial government doing remote community assessments, and La Ronge was on my schedule for a 3-day site visit. Normally, I'd take Highway 2 straight up, but that morning the highway had been closed due to a blizzard that had dumped 40 centimeters of snow overnight and showed no signs of stopping. The alternative route was the ice road across Lac La Ronge. Ice roads are common in northern Saskatchewan. During winter. The province plows and marks routes across frozen lakes, creating shortcuts that can save hours of driving time. They're safe when properly maintained, when the ice is thick enough and the weather is stable, but they're also one of the most dangerous ways to travel. If the ice is too thin, if you drive too fast, if the temperature has been fluctuating, you can go through. And if you go through the ice in the middle of a lake in January, your chances of survival are almost zero. I checked the ice road conditions before I left. The report said the ice was 36 inches thick, well above the minimum safe thickness. The road had been plowed the day before. Weather was cold, minus 28 degrees Celsius, which meant the ice would be solid. Everything said it was safe. I left Prince Albert around 9 in the morning. The drive to the ice road access point took about an hour, through increasingly isolated terrain. The plowed ice road entrance was marked with signs and reflective posts, a clear path leading out onto the vast frozen expanse of Lac La Ronge. The lake is massive, one of the largest in Saskatchewan, and in winter it becomes a frozen highway, connecting communities that are otherwise separated by miles of rough terrain. I drove slowly, 20 kilometers per hour, following the marked route. The ice was clear of snow where it had been plowed, showing the dark ice beneath. Snow was falling lightly, reducing visibility, but not enough to be dangerous. I'd made it maybe halfway across, probably 10 kilometers from shore, when I saw the truck. It was ahead of me on the ice road, maybe 200 meters away. An old pickup, faded red, probably from the 1980s, based on the body style. It was sitting in the middle of the marked route with its lights on, headlights and interior dome light both burning bright against the gray winter day. As I got closer, I could see that the driver's door was hanging open. I slowed down even more, pulling up about 20 meters behind the truck. I put my car in park and sat there for a moment, trying to assess the situation. The truck's engine was running. I could see the exhaust coming from the tailpipe, a steady stream of vapor in the cold air. But there was no one visible inside the cab, no one standing nearby, no other vehicles around. I got out of my car, the cold hitting me like a physical force. -28 feels like a different kind of cold when you're standing on ice in the middle of a frozen lake. I called out, my voice getting swallowed by the wind and the vast openness of the lake. No response. I walked toward the truck carefully, watching my footing on the plowed ice. The truck was empty. Keys in the ignition, engine idling, heat blowing from the vents. The seat was positioned like someone had just been sitting there. A coffee cup sat in the holder, still steaming slightly. The radio was on, playing static between stations. Everything suggested someone had been driving this truck seconds ago, but there was no one there. I walked around the vehicle, looking for footprints in the snow that covered the ice beyond the plowed road. Nothing, just unbroken snow in all directions. No tracks leading away from the truck, no sign that anyone had walked anywhere. Like the driver had simply vanished while sitting behind the wheel. That's when I noticed the ice. Around the truck, radiating out from the wheels and the undercarriage, were cracks. Not old stress cracks that you sometimes see in ice, but fresh cracks, spider webbing out in all directions. I could hear them, a low, creaking sound, like wood settling but deeper, more ominous. The cracks were growing as I watched, extending further, creating a network of weakness in ice that should have been solid. I backed away from the truck quickly. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away, to get back in my car, to get off this section of ice. I kept my eyes on those cracks, watching them spread, and as I retreated, I noticed something else. The truck was sitting lower than it should have been. Not much, maybe an inch, but definitely lower. The ice beneath it was sagging, flexing under a weight that shouldn't have been a problem for ice that was supposedly 36 inches thick. I got back in my car and assessed my options. I couldn't turn around on the ice road. The plowed section was only about 15 feet wide, and trying to maneuver off the marked path was asking to get stuck or to break through thin ice. I had to go forward, which meant driving past the truck, but I needed to give it a wide berth, needed to avoid those cracks, needed to get past as quickly and safely as possible. I put my car in gear and steered to the edge of the plowed section, as far from the truck as I could get while still staying on the marked road. I accelerated gently, not wanting to create any additional stress on the ice, and started to pass the truck on its right side. As I came level with it, I glanced over. The driver's door was still hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. The interior light still burning, the engine still running, and sitting lower, definitely sitting lower now. I could see water on the ice around the tires, dark and spreading. I kept driving, forcing myself not to accelerate too much, not to panic. In my rearview mirror, I watched the truck recede behind me, and then, slowly, impossibly, it started to sink. Not fast like you'd expect if ice breaks. There was no sudden collapse, no splash, no dramatic plunge into the depths. The truck just settled lower, inch by inch, the ice around it breaking in slow motion, water welling up around the tires. The headlights stayed on, visible even as they dipped below the level of the ice. The dome light continued to glow as the cab tilted forward, the open door pointing up at the sky like an accusation. I stopped my car and watched. I couldn't help it. I sat there on that frozen lake and watched an entire truck sink through ice that should have been solid, watched it disappear gradually into water that was probably 40 feet deep and cold enough to kill in minutes. The whole process took maybe 90 seconds, and then it was gone. Just dark ice and open water where a truck had been, the hole already starting to freeze over in the brutal cold. I drove the rest of the way across the lake as fast as I dared, which wasn't very fast. Every crack in the ice looked like a threat. Every sound made me think I was about to go through. I made it to the far shore and didn't stop driving until I was in Lorong, parked in front of the RCMP detachment. I reported what I'd seen to the constable on duty. I gave him the approximate location, described the truck, told him about the sinking. He listened with an expression I couldn't read, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Did you see anyone?" he asked. "Any sign of a person?" "No. The truck was empty. Door open, engine running, but no driver. He nodded slowly. "We'll send someone to check it out. But Mr. Morrison, I have to tell you, we get this report every winter. Someone driving the ice road sees an old red pickup, door open, sitting on the ice. Sometimes it's sinking when they see it. Sometimes it just vanishes. We've checked dozens of times. There's never a hole in the ice. Never any sign of a vehicle. Never any missing person reports that match." I stared at him. "You're telling me I didn't see what I just saw?" "I'm telling you that you're not the first person to see it, and you probably won't be the last." I stayed in La Ronge for my scheduled 3 days, did my work, tried to focus on the job, but I couldn't stop thinking about that truck, about how real it had been, the sound of the engine, the glow of the lights, the steam from the exhaust, about the cracks spreading in the ice, about the gradual sinking, about the certainty I'd felt that I was watching something die, even though there'd been no one to save. Before I left La Ronge, I spent an evening in the public library, digging through old newspapers and local history archives. I found what I was looking for in a newspaper from March 1987. A brief article about a man named Thomas Bering, who'd gone through the ice on Lac La Ronge in late January. He'd been driving an old red pickup truck, taking the ice road from La Ronge to Prince Albert. He'd left La Ronge in the morning and never arrived at his destination. Search and rescue found tire tracks on the ice road leading to an area where the ice had recently broken. They never found the body. They never found the truck. The article mentioned that Bering had been alone, that his truck's door had been found open on the ice near the break, suggesting he'd tried to escape the vehicle. But there were no tracks in the snow, no sign he'd made it out of the water. The search was called off after 3 days. Thomas Bering was presumed drowned, his body trapped beneath the ice, or carried away by the current that flows, even in winter, beneath the frozen surface. I found 3 more reports over the years since then. All of them mentioned sightings of an old red pickup on the ice road, all of them in January or February, all of them describing the same thing: door open, engine running, no driver visible. Some reports mentioned the truck sinking. Others just said it vanished when they looked away or when they came back with help. The RCMP had investigated the first few reports seriously, searching the ice, looking for breaks or weak spots. They'd found nothing. The ice where the truck was supposedly seen was always solid, always thick enough to be safe. No holes, no cracks, no sign that any vehicle had gone through. Eventually, they'd stopped investigating. It had become a local legend, something people talked about in the winter, a ghost story about the ice roads. But I'd seen it. I'd stood 20 meters away from that truck, heard its engine running, seen the steam from its exhaust. I'd watched the ice crack beneath it, watched it sink slowly through ice that search and rescue crews had verified was solid. I'd witnessed something that everyone said was impossible, and I had no explanation for it. I made the return drive a week later, taking Highway 2 this time, even though it meant an extra hour of travel. I couldn't bring myself to drive the ice road again. I told myself it was because of the weather, because the highway was open now, and there was no reason to take the risk. But really, I was terrified of seeing that truck again, of watching it sink, of standing helpless while something drowned over and over in the same spot, replaying Thomas Bering's death every winter for nearly 40 years. I've talked to other people who've seen it. I found a forum online for northern Saskatchewan residents, and when I posted about my experience, 3 other people replied with similar stories. All of them had seen the truck on the ice road. All of them had watched it sink or vanish. None of them could explain it, but all of them refused to use the ice road anymore, preferred to take the long way around, couldn't shake the feeling that they'd witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. One woman wrote that she'd known Thomas Bering. He'd been her cousin, a logger who'd lived in La Ronge his whole life. She said he'd known the ice roads better than anyone, that he'd been driving them for 20 years before he died. She said the family never believed it was an accident, that Thomas was too experienced to drive on bad ice, too careful to make that kind of mistake. But the investigation found no evidence of foul play, no reason to think it was anything but a tragic accident. A good man going through the ice on a route he'd driven 100 times before. She said that every year on the anniversary of his death, his wife would stand on the shore of Lac La Ronge and watch the ice road. She did it for 18 years, until her own death in 2005, looking for her husband's truck, looking for some sign that he was still out there, still trying to make it home. She never saw anything. but other people did. Strangers driving the ice road would see what she never could: her husband's truck, door open, engine running, sitting exactly where it had been when the ice broke beneath him in 1987. I don't drive in northern Saskatchewan in winter anymore. I schedule my site visits for summer, or I send someone else if it's urgent. I tell people it's because of the road conditions, because the winter travel is too unpredictable. But really, I'm afraid of seeing that truck again, of stopping to help, of walking up to it and finding it empty but running, of standing there on the ice while cracks spread beneath my feet, of watching it sink again while I'm powerless to do anything but witness. Because that's what I think is happening. Thomas Bering is still going through the ice, still drowning in Lac La Ronge, still stuck in the moment of his death, and for reasons I don't understand, that moment has become visible to others. Not all the time, not to everyone, but to enough people, often enough, that it's become a legend, a ghost story that people tell, a warning to be careful on the ice roads. But it's not a story, it's real. It's a man dying over and over in the same spot, his truck sinking through ice that was too thin or too weak or just unlucky. It's a moment of death that somehow got trapped, became a loop that plays out every winter when conditions are right. And there's nothing I can do about it, nothing anyone can do. We can only watch and report it and drive away, knowing we've witnessed something impossible, knowing that somewhere beneath the ice of Lac La Ronge, there's a truck that never reached the bottom, a man who never finished drowning, a death that hasn't ended even though it happened nearly 40 years ago. I think about his wife, standing on the shore for 18 years, watching for a truck that would never come home. I think about how she died not knowing that other people were seeing what she couldn't, that her husband's final moments were being witnessed by strangers while she searched in vain. And I think about the ice roads, about how many people drive them every winter, about how thin the boundary is between solid ground and deadly water, about how easy it is to go from safe to doomed in the space of a heartbeat. The ice roads are still there, people still use them, and every winter someone will see that truck, will stop to help, will find it empty and sinking and vanishing, leaving no trace except the memory of what they witnessed. And they'll carry that memory forward. Another person who knows that Thomas Bering is still dying on Lac La Ronge, still trying to escape his truck, still trapped in January 1987, while the world moves forward without him. I saw it. I saw the truck. I saw it sink, and I'll never forget it. Never stop wondering if I should have done something different, even though there was nothing I could do. Never stop feeling like I abandoned someone who needed help, even though there was no one there to save. The ice roads wait. The truck appears. The death replays. And all we can do is watch and remember and tell the story to anyone who'll listen, to warn them, to let them know that some endings don't finish, that some deaths don't stop, that some moments get frozen in time just like the lakes get frozen in winter, solid enough to drive on, until suddenly, without warning, they're not. I arrived in Uranium City on a gray afternoon in September 2023, flying in on a charter plane that made the trip from Saskatoon twice a week. Uranium City sits on the northern edge of Lake Athabasca, about as remote as you can get in Saskatchewan, and still be in a community with roads and buildings. It used to have 5,000 people back in the 1970s when the uranium mines were operating at full capacity, but the mines closed in 1982 and the population collapsed. Now there are maybe 70 people left, holdouts who stayed because they had nowhere else to go or because they couldn't imagine living anywhere else. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'd gotten a grant to make a short film about abandoned northern communities. Uranium City was perfect dramatic decline, interesting history, spectacular setting on the lake. I planned to spend a week there, shooting footage of the abandoned buildings and interviewing the remaining residents about what it was like to watch your town die around you. Robert Klein was one of the first people I met. He was sitting on the porch of his house when I walked by scouting locations, and he called out to me, asked what I was doing in town. I explained my project and he invited me inside, said he had stories I'd want to hear. He was maybe 80 years old, weathered in the way people get when they spend their lives in harsh climates. But his eyes were sharp and his memory was clear. We talked for over an hour that first day. He told me about the boom years, about when the mines were running 3 shifts and money was good, and everyone thought Uranium City was going to be a permanent fixture on the map. He told me about the decline, the rumors that the uranium was running out, the company denials, And then the sudden announcement in 1981 that the mines would close. Most people left within 6 months. The rest trickled away over the next few years. Robert stayed because his wife was buried in the town cemetery, and he'd promised her he wouldn't leave. On my third day in town, I went back to Robert's house for a formal interview. I set up my camera and lights, and we talked on camera about his life, about the town's history, about what it meant to be one of the last people in a place that was slowly being reclaimed by wilderness. After we finished, I was packing up my equipment when he asked if I wanted to hear something interesting, something he'd never shown anyone else. He went into his bedroom and came back carrying a cardboard box filled with cassette tapes, maybe 20 of them, old TDK and Maxell cassettes from the 1970s, each labeled with dates and numbers in faded handwriting. He set the box on his kitchen table and pulled out one of the tapes. In 1979, he said, the company started having problems in the deepest shafts. Structural problems, they said. Cracks in the rock, shifts that worried the engineers. They brought in equipment to monitor it, to listen for sounds that might indicate the mine was becoming unstable. Microphones, placed at different depths, recording constantly. He held up the cassette tape. They started hearing things, not the sounds they expected, not rock settling or water dripping or the normal sounds you get in a mine. They heard voices. I must have looked skeptical because he smiled slightly and continued. I know how that sounds. Everyone thought the miners were playing pranks at first, talking into the microphones, making jokes, but the sounds were coming from the deepest shafts, places where no one was working, and they were in languages no one recognized. The company brought in linguists, brought in experts. No one could identify what was being said. He put the cassette into an old tape player on his counter. They recorded for 6 months. Then they sealed the deepest shafts with concrete, destroyed all the recordings, and told everyone it had been equipment malfunction. But I'd been down there. I'd heard it myself, and I'd made copies before they destroyed everything. He pressed play. For the first few seconds, there was nothing but the hiss of blank tape. Then sounds emerged. Whispers, soft and layered, like dozens of people speaking at once in very low voices. The quality was poor, the recording old and degraded, but the voices were unmistakable. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. And I'd spent years traveling the world for documentaries, hearing dozens of languages. The whispers continued for maybe a minute, then changed to something else. Chanting, rhythmic and repetitive, rising and falling in patterns that felt deliberate, purposeful, and underneath the chanting was another sound, a low, steady pounding. Not mechanical, not like a drill or a piece of equipment, more like something striking rock with irregular rhythm, the way a person might pound on a door or a wall. Then came the crying. It started as one voice, then another joined, then another, until it sounded like dozens of people weeping simultaneously. Not hysterical crying, quiet, hopeless crying. The sound of people who'd been crying so long they had no strength left for anything more. Robert turned off the tape player. That's from level 12, about a mile underground. They recorded for 3 hours straight that day. It's all like that. Sometimes whispers, sometimes chanting, sometimes crying, and always that pounding underneath everything. What did the company say it was? I asked. They said the microphones were picking up sounds from the surface, somehow transmitted through the rock, or that it was acoustic artifacts, sounds created by the equipment itself. But I went down there. I stood in those shafts with my own ears and I heard it. No microphones, no equipment, just the sounds coming from deeper in the rock, from places we'd never mined, places where no one had ever been. He pulled out more tapes, showed me the labels. Different dates, different levels of the mine, all from that 6-month period in 1979. They sealed level 12 and level 13 in January 1980. Filled the deepest shafts with concrete, hundreds of yards of it, then welded steel doors over the access points. Said it was because the shafts were structurally unsound, but I think they were trying to contain something, to seal whatever was down there so no one would hear it anymore. And did it work? I asked. Robert was quiet for a moment. Depends on what you mean by work. They stopped the miners from hearing it, but it's still down there. The sounds haven't stopped. They've just been sealed away where no one can hear them. Except sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear them. Faint, like they're coming from very far away. That pounding, trying to break through. I asked if I could make copies of the tapes. Robert hesitated, then agreed. He said he'd been thinking about destroying them, about whether keeping them was a good idea, but he also felt like someone should know, should have proof that it happened. We spent the next few hours digitizing the recordings onto my laptop. 20 cassettes, maybe 12 hours of audio total. I left Uranium City 4 days later with my footage, my interviews, and those recordings. Robert walked me to the airstrip, said he hoped I'd make something good, something that would help people understand what had been lost when the mines closed. I said I would. He died 3 weeks later, in his sleep. Heart attack, the few remaining residents said. Peaceful. He was buried next to his wife in the town cemetery. I never made the documentary about Uranium City. I couldn't focus on anything except those recordings. I had them analyzed by audio forensics experts, by geologists who specialized in mining acoustics, by linguists who studied obscure and extinct languages. The results were consistent and unhelpful. The recordings were genuine, not faked or manipulated. The sounds were real sounds, recorded in an environment consistent with deep underground spaces, but no one could explain what was making them. The linguists said the chanting and whispers didn't match any known language, living or dead. The patterns were consistent with language repetition, rhythm, structure, but the actual sounds didn't correspond to any linguistic database. One professor told me it sounded like prayer, like ritual speech, but in a language that either no longer exists or never existed at all. The geologist said the pounding could be explained by rock settling or water pressure, but the irregular rhythm made that unlikely. Natural geological processes create consistent patterns. This was irregular, unpredictable, like something or someone striking rock with varying force and timing. The crying was the hardest part. Every expert I played it for had the same reaction. An initial dismissal, probably wind or water creating sound artifacts. Then, as they listened longer, a growing discomfort. One audio specialist told me she'd analyzed thousands of recordings of human voices, that she knew what real crying sounded like versus manufactured or manipulated sound. She said the crying on these tapes was real. Genuine human distress, captured on ancient recording equipment, a mile underground in a place where no one should have been. I started researching the history of the Uranium City mines. The mining operations began in 1952, expanded rapidly through the 1960s and 72nd, then shut down abruptly in 1982 when the uranium deposits became economically unviable. The company's public records mention nothing unusual, no accidents in the deep shafts, no mysterious phenomena, but I found references in old miner interviews, in letters and journals kept by people who'd worked there. Multiple miners reported hearing sounds in the deepest levels, voices, crying, inexplicable noises. The reports were dismissed as stress or fatigue or the effects of working in extreme conditions. One miner wrote in a 1978 journal entry that he'd been working on level 13 when he heard singing, clear and beautiful, coming from an unmined section of rock. He'd reported it to his supervisor, who'd told him to get more sleep and stop talking nonsense. Another former miner I tracked down, a man named Douglas Chen who'd moved to Vancouver after the mines closed, told me he'd heard the sounds too. He'd been part of the crew that helped seal level 12 and 13 in early 1980. He said the company had been desperate to finish the work quickly, that they'd poured concrete continuously for 3 weeks, working around the clock. When I asked him why, he said, because the sounds were getting louder, closer, like whatever was making them was moving toward us through the rock. I've listened to those recordings hundreds of times now. I've played them for psychologists, for anthropologists, for paranormal researchers, for skeptics and believers, and everyone in between. No one can explain them, but everyone agrees on certain things. The sounds are human or human-like. They suggest intelligence, communication, purpose. They come from deep underground, from a place where no human should have been. And underneath everything else, that pounding continues. Steady, persistent, like something trying to break through. The mine shafts are sealed now, have been for over 40 years. Hundreds of yards of concrete, steel doors, and then another mile of rock between the surface and level 12. Whatever is down there is trapped, contained, isolated from the world above. But the recordings remain. Digital files on my laptop and backup drives, copies of sounds that were captured in 1979 and then supposedly destroyed. I tried to include them in the documentary. I spent months working on a version that focused on the recordings, on what they might mean, on the mystery of sounds from deep underground. But every time I tried to structure it, tried to create a narrative, it fell apart because I don't have answers. I only have questions and recordings that shouldn't exist, and the testimony of a dead man who spent the last 40 years of his life listening to echoes from a sealed mine. Sometimes, late at night, I listen to the recordings with headphones on, the volume turned up, trying to hear details I might have missed. The whispers sometimes sound like they're forming words, like if I could just isolate the right frequencies or enhance the right sections, I'd be able to understand what they're saying. The chanting has patterns that repeat, like verses in a song or responses in a liturgy. And the crying sounds like people who've been crying for so long, they've forgotten what they're crying about, who continue from pure habit or despair. And always, underneath everything else, that pounding. Sometimes it sounds close, like it's just on the other side of the rock. Sometimes it sounds distant, echoing through vast spaces. But it never stops, never pauses, just continues, patient and relentless, trying to break through barriers that were designed to be permanent. I think about what Robert said, about how he could still hear it sometimes late at night. I think about the miners who reported hearing voices from unmined rock. I think about the company sealing those shafts so quickly, so desperately, like they were terrified of what might happen if they didn't. And I think about what Douglas Chen said, about the sounds getting closer, about something moving through rock toward the miners. I think about level 12 and level 13, sealed behind concrete and steel, a mile of rock above them, and whatever is down there still pounding, still trying to reach the surface. The recordings are my legacy from Robert Klein, his gift or his burden to me. I don't know what to do with them. I don't know if I should share them more widely or keep them contained, because everyone who listens to them is changed by them. Everyone who hears that crying, that chanting, that endless pounding, carries it with them afterward, hears it in quiet moments, wonders what could make sounds like that, what could survive sealed in darkness a mile underground, what could continue crying and pounding for over 40 years with no hope of escape or rescue. Uranium City is still there, still dying slowly, down to fewer than 70 people now. The mines are sealed, the shafts are concrete, and whatever is at the bottom is trapped. But the recordings prove it exists, prove that something is down there, has been down there since at least 1979, maybe longer. Something that speaks in no known language, that cries like humans cry, that pounds on rock like it's trying to get out. And every time I listen to those recordings, every time I hear that rhythmic pounding beneath the whispers and chanting and crying, I'm certain of one thing. Whatever is down there hasn't given up, hasn't accepted its imprisonment. It's still trying to break through, still pounding on rock that's probably worn smooth by now from decades of impact. Still hoping, maybe, that one day the rock will crack, the concrete will fail, the barriers will give way. Still trying to get out, still trying to reach us. Still making sounds that no one was meant to hear, trapped in darkness so complete it makes the surface night seem bright, in silence so absolute that the only sounds are its own voice and its own endless, desperate pounding. The recordings are on my laptop, backed up in 3 separate locations, analyzed and studied and discussed, but never explained, never understood, just preserved, like the sounds themselves are preserved in digital format, taken from magnetic tape that captured something impossible in a mine that was sealed to keep that impossibility contained. I have them, I listen to them, and I wonder what it would sound like now if someone could lower a microphone back down to level 12, past the concrete and steel, into the darkness where no one has been for 40 years. I wonder if it would sound the same, or if, after 40 years of isolation, after 40 years of pounding on unyielding rock, the sounds would be different, angrier maybe, or more desperate, or completely inhuman, whatever shred of humanity that might have been there worn away by decades of trying and failing to break free. I don't want to know, but I think about it constantly. Think about those sealed shafts beneath the ghost town of Uranium City. Think about sounds that shouldn't exist, captured on tapes that were supposed to be destroyed, preserved now in digital format for anyone willing to listen. Think about something trapped, something crying, something pounding, something that's been trying to get out for at least 45 years, maybe longer. Something that hasn't stopped yet, and probably never will.